Are we ready?
Not quite. Now you're live.
Okay. May call to order the meeting of the San Ramon Planning Commission for Tuesday, October 6, 2020. First, before roll call, I'd like to have the city attorney give a brief dissertation on our teleconferencing rights and obligations.
Thank you, Chair Wallace. Prior to roll call, I would like to make clear for the record of this meeting, and it should be reflected in the minutes, that the governor has issued executive orders relaxing the requirements pertaining to remote meetings under the Brown Act. The executive orders authorize this planning commission to hold public meetings by teleconference during the COVID-19 crisis. I previously went over specific provisions of the Brown Act that have been temporarily amended or suspended in order to allow for this meeting to take place by teleconference, and this meeting will comply with all such provisions. Madam Recording Secretary, it would now be appropriate for you to conduct roll call, after which I'd ask the chair to recognize me in order to confirm certain matters for the record. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. Item 2, roll call. Commissioner Alpert.
Here.
Commissioner Frank.
Here.
Commissioner Marks.
Here.
Vice Chair Kuznick.
Here.
And Chair Wallace.
I'm here. Thank you. Now, Ms. Poon, we're going to recognize you again because we have another statement about making sure that we are who we appear to be.
That's correct. So I'd like to now ask the chair, the vice chair, and the other commission members 3 questions. Rather than ask you to respond separately to these questions, I'll ask all 3. And if the answer is no to any one of them, please indicate by physically raising your hand. Question 1, can you hear me well? Question 2, have you been able to hear our proceedings up until now? And question 3, were you able to hear all of your fellow commissioners clearly as they responded to roll call? If the answer to any of these questions is no, please respond by physically raising your hand. All right. Seeing no one raise their hand, the record should reflect that all commissioners have indicated they are able to hear each other and these proceedings clearly. I would next request that any commission members speak up at this time. If you have any reason to believe that anyone representing themselves to be a planning commissioner is not who they say they are. All right, and hearing no comment, the record should reflect that no commission member has expressed doubt that each and every commission member participating by teleconference is in fact the commission member they are representing themselves to be. And finally, I would now like to advise the chair and the commission members and the recording secretary that any votes taken during the teleconference portion of this meeting must be taken by roll call. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Poon. Ms. Shaw, could you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United
States of America
and to the
and to the
republic
republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all. Thank you. Item number 4 on the agenda tonight is public comment. This is for matters that are not on the agenda tonight for public comment. There being one such agenda, which is the CITYWALK Development Agreement hearing. Ms. Shaw, could you give the public some words of wisdom on what this aspect of public comment concerns?
If you wish to speak under public comment, you may click the raise your hand button on your computer or *9 on your telephone to request to speak when public comment is being taken. You will be unmuted when it is your turn to make your comment for up to 3 minutes. After the allotted time, you will then be remuted. At this time, those who wish to address the Planning Commission on any item not already in tonight's agenda will be able to do so. We have no hands raised.
No sea of hands. Okay. All right. We'll move on to item number 5, which is additions and revisions to the agenda. We have none. Item number 6, consent calendar items. We have none. Item 7.1, minutes from the regular meeting of the Planning Commission on September 15th, 2020. Do any of the commissioners have changes, corrections, or comments? If we have none, I vaguely seem to hear an echo of a motion to approve bouncing around here.
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Okay, well, the motion's been made to approve the minutes. Do I hear a second?
Mr. Chair, I will move, I'll second that motion.
All right, the motion to approve the minutes from the September meeting has been moved and seconded. May we have a roll call vote, Ms. Shaw?
So mover Commissioner Marks,
Aye.
seconder Commissioner Alpert,
Aye.
Vice Chair Kuznick. Oh,
Aye.
sorry.
Yeah,
Commissioner,
that's right.
Commissioner Frank,
Abstain since I was not present.
and then Chair Wallace.
Aye.
Okay, item 7.1 passes.
Okay, four zip, one abstention. Item number 8, continued items after closing a public hearing. We have none tonight. Item number 9, continued hearings, open public hearing. We have none tonight. Item 10, public hearing, new items. We do have something tonight. We have item 10.1, the CITYWALK development agreements as in plural. We have a staff report by our Community Development Director, Ms. Chamberlain. You have the floor, ma'am.
Good evening. Give me a moment so I can get my screen share going and bring up the presentation.
Okay.
And there it is. All right, one last change here. There we go. Well, good evening, Chair, members of the Commission. Tonight, I'm going to present to you the proposed CITYWALK development agreements. The first part of the presentation, just a little bit of background that we all familiar with, but I'm going to run through that very quickly, and then we'll focus on the negotiated parts of the agreement for the Commission to discuss tonight. So just as a reminder, the project has been approved with the construction timing of about 27 years, with 4,500 units, 15% affordable. There's a hotel, there's commercial space, parks, shared parking, pedestrian circulation, transit hubs, and other community amenities as part of the project. So just a reminder, if we all forgot what CITYWALK looks like on the approved plan. And just a little more background, the applications were filed in July of last year. The Planning Commission held their required public hearings public hearings in June, July, and August of this year, where they approved the master plan and certified the environmental document. On August 14th, an appeal was filed to the Planning Commission approval. On September 20th, the City Council did recertify the environmental document and upheld the Planning Commission's decision of approving the project. So just a bit of background on what a development agreement is. Development agreements are allowed under state law and allow cities to enter into agreements to eliminate the lack of certainty in the approval of development projects. The development agreement provides assurance to applicants that upon approval of a project, they may proceed with the project in accordance with the rules and regulations that existed on the date it was approved. Agreements do lock in city impact fees unless negotiated otherwise. They are a contractual arrangement. In exchange for entering into a development agreement, cities can negotiate additional community-wide benefit that we normally could not get as part of the approval process. And it's very common for large-scale master plan projects to enter into development agreements. So as this agreement, the city negotiators were the city manager, the city attorney, and myself. And going into negotiations with Sunset Development, we focus on 4 key points: citywide goals and policies, balancing the needs of the city, the benefits of the project, and the additional community benefit that could be achieved through the execution of a development agreement. So all 3 agreements are virtually identical. There are subtle nuances based on ownership interest, specific uses for each parcel. The legal descriptions will differ. And specifically for the development agreement for parcel 3A, it does not apply to the hotel site, which is an approved project, and it commits the developer to construct a 200 square foot police substation at the request of our chief of police. So when we looked at the benefits that we negotiated in the agreement, the slides that you're going to see, everything is taken in totality. So all the benefits are taken together that make up the entire agreement and should be viewed as one entire package. So I know we have a couple different items that we'll be discussing, but really the value of the development agreement is everything that is taken in totality. So one of the main things that we spent a lot of time working on or discussing was this requirement for a funding mechanism. As we all know, and attached to your packet tonight, Bishop Ranch conducted an economic and fiscal impact analysis. And so at build out of the project in 2019 dollars, it showed that the city would receive an additional $600,000 in net revenue above the cost of city services. Of course, this is dependent on the tax sharing agreement amendment that we're negotiating with the county right now. And if that negotiations are successful, the city will receive our share of the property tax on the residential uses in perpetuity. And so determining how we proceed with this, if there are material changes in the assumptions that were used in the methodology for the 2020 fiscal impact analysis, and which could create a revenue shortfall. So we structured the agreement to monitor revenues to the city throughout project construction and at project completion. So if we get through all project construction, there's no net fall or no shortfall, but we arrive at the end of the project and we see, oh, some of those revenues didn't come through, we have the ability to complete another fiscal impact analysis to set a funding mechanism in perpetuity to ensure the city does remain financially whole. And so we would do a fiscal impact analysis if there's a shortfall determined, and if the shortfall is determined, we would then execute a funding mechanism in the form of, it could be a CFD, it could be another assessment mechanism. It really depends at that time. So the other thing we were able to negotiate, which is also in the conditions of approval, is the point of sale determination. This allows the city to receive the construction sales tax directly. Otherwise, the construction sales tax that Sunset and other developers would be spending would go into the county pool, and we would get a much smaller share, I think around 5% or so. So, and you'll see in the slides towards the end of my presentation, on average, that's about an additional $200,000 annually to the city. And then finally, the third component, the larger component of our negotiations, was the park credit and fee calculation. So in approaching the negotiations, we were guided by the City Council's goals, policies in the General Plan 2035, and the Parks, Trails, Open Space, and Recreation Master Plan. The City Council goals to prioritize housing in the core began in 2017 with the development of our retail strategy that guided the City Council in preserving high-performing retail shopping centers and locating housing to the city core to preserve open space, the character of our existing neighborhoods, and tying to the proposed walking district. So the City Council's goals that were adopted last year really focus on putting that housing in the city core, preserving our well-performing retail, our commercial, and our open space, obtain permanent open space along the city boundaries, and promote that walkability within and to local shopping centers. That would be the walking district that we will be proceeding with very shortly. And secondly, as I mentioned, we relied on the General Plan 2035 goals that require us to look to provide a variety of park and recreational opportunities. Annabelle Lake is an example of an opportunity we do not have. Privately owned and maintained park supports our continued private partnership with Sunset and relieves the city of taking on additional park maintenance. And then finally, we look to the newly adopted Parks, Trails, Open Space, and Recreation Master Plan. And the master plan has some great new strategies that I know the Parks Commission is very excited to work towards. And one is really creating those connections to neighborhoods which would be the proposed walking district. And there are two connections to the Iron Horse Trail, one through BR1A and one through BR3A. And Annabelle Lake and Lake Cecilia not only provide the visual access that's discussed in the Parks Master Plan, but also the public access. Additionally, the strategies in the Parks Master Plan really seek to have plans to develop those parks on the west side that have yet to be constructed. And so Henry Ranch and the Woodlot, Sunset has agreed to construct those as part of this development agreement. Additionally, they are agreeing to convert the turf field at Iron Horse Middle School to synthetic turf, which would help to enhance our ability for our active sports field use. So a little bit about the Park and Recreation Facilities Impact Fee. As we know, and as conditioned, the Park and Rec fee is the project only has a Park and Recreation Facilities Impact Fee obligation. That means they're only required to pay the $10,957 per unit fee, which is about a $49 million obligation. It is a fee payment only. No park construction is required with the project. Since it's a multifamily rental project, their only obligation based on our ordinances is that they pay the Park and Rec Facilities Impact Fee. And so the CITYWALK project includes 40.35 acres of park amenities. There are 10 acres in the parkway, the walking district, 22.5 acres in lakes, 2.35 acres of city green for civic uses, and 5 acres spread over 5 parks ranging in size from 0.6 to 1.5 acres. So the part of this development agreement, Sunset is requesting park acreage credit to offset their $49 million fee obligation. And so this is the map of the city parks that was in the approved plan. As you can see, the 2 lakes in red and blue. And then the walking district is the green belt around the BR 2600. And then the smaller parks in green that are located throughout the development. And this is just a graphic showing that the master plan is within a half mile of 2 parks that are greater than 2 acres in size, which would be our Central Park and then our Memorial Park. So in determining the value of the park credit, which we'll get into in more detail, we look back to the City Council adopted 2017 Kaiser-Marston fee study. We wanted to determine the land acquisition cost average value was based on land sales in San Ramon, Dublin, and Pleasanton reused to get to that 1.56 per million acre cost. And the park improvement cost was based on the development costs of new existing parks within San Ramon, which, as you see on the slide, that park improvement cost is about $329,000 per acre. So to construct and improve an acre of land in San Ramon is about $1.9 million. So we had to determine at build out, general plan build out, how many additional park acres the city would have to provide. Since the project is only required to fee out, it would be the city's obligation to acquire and construct those future parks. So we did our calculation for our parkland dedication ordinance, which is based on the net new housing units. As you recall, CITYWALK already had about 1,682 units based on the approved city center project, those units located on BR3A, and then the units we transferred from BR 2600 with the economic element update. So this is just the net new need. The 1,600 were already included in the general plan 2035 build up, but the additional 2,800 were not. And so based on the calculations and the cost in the fee study, for the city to construct 38.65 acres of park, it would cost us about $73 million for a city as a whole. The CITYWALK fee obligation is only $49.3 million. So there's a gap in funding if the city were to construct all 38 acres of required parkland to meet our 6.5 acres of parkland requirements at general plan build out. So I kind of put this little graphic in more kind of to break up the presentation, but to demonstrate that the total value that we began our negotiations at was $49.3 million, which was their fee obligation only. So that was the value that we used as our starting point. And we divided that between 3 stools on this 3 legs of the stool. One is the park credit, one is the park fee, and one is the offsite park construction cost. So those are the 3 elements that went into making up this $49.3 million value. So what we looked at construction of the 40 acres of park, which is privately owned and maintained and fully open to the public. So part of what did not get factored into this calculation was that long-term operation and maintenance cost, as you can see on this slide. So Sunset, based on their estimates, will be spending on their own without credit, $110,000 per year for the neighborhood parks, including the city green, $160,000 per year in maintenance for the parkways, and $240,000 per year for the lakes and the lake parks. That's their own maintenance cost that was not included as any part of this negotiation. So we have provided a credit of 48%, or 19.3 acres of parkland, using the Kaiser Marston impact fee study to determine that cost. And I'll get to that in a minute. And this was really based on the location and the utility of the parks and lakes to the general public. Accessibility was kind of the main key in that aspect. So this equates to the city receiving 43.5 acres of park for about $36 million. So we took the 19 acres of parkland and multiplied that by the 1.97 or $1.9 million to acquire and construct parkland if the city would have to go do it on their own. So additionally, as part of the park credit and fee proposal, we negotiated the construction of the following offsite parks: the Woodlot, Henry Ranch, and the Iron Horse School Middle School synthetic turf replacement. So this is a total contribution of about $8.8 million. And essentially we took the acreage and multiplied it by the cost to construct for Woodlot and Henry Ranch, because the land is already owned by the city. And our Iron Horse School synthetic turf cost was provided to us by our Public Works Department. And so these costs are capped as a total contribution for construction of all three projects, as is for construction cost only. The design and permits will be the responsibility of the city to deal with. And so finally, the third leg of that stool is the balance to get to the $49.3 million was roughly $6.15 million. And so that's how we have calculated the balance. So I should back up. So the Park and Rec impact fee was about $6.135 million. And so as you saw in the staff report in the development agreement, that fee's been adjusted by inflation every 5 years, which gets us to the 6.15 in total fee obligation over the lifetime of the project, or the construction of the project. Sunset has also offered up, should the developer elect not to construct the amphitheater, they'll contribute $750,000 to the city's park development fund. The community center, which was originally planned for BR1A, has been eliminated from the master plan. There was some discussion really of its value, its benefit. Was it accessible to the public? So Sunset has decided to eliminate that, and they can speak more to that. And so essentially combining those three legs of the stool, the park credit, the offsite park construction, and then the balance and impact fees, Sunset's total park contribution is $51.6 million, exceeding the $49.3 million fee obligation. So we're able to negotiate about $2.3 million in value to the city than just their fee payment of 49.3. So I want to put a summary slide together. So now it's a lot of numbers that I've thrown out. So just to summarize, we have a 48% park credit, which is the 19 acres times the 1.9 million to get to that value. The construction of the offsite parks at 8.6, and then the balance in park and rec facilities impact fee of 6.15. So there's our total contribution, the 51.6 million, their current fee obligation, and the additional benefit the city is gaining from entering into the development agreement, about $2.3 million in value. And so the other component we negotiated was their open space impact fee. Their total fee payment at $750 per unit is about $3.3 million. So that fee, based on our Nexus impact fee study, is maxed. So when the city council adopted the fee study, they charged the upper end of the fee. So it is a flat fee, and there are no adjustment factors for that fee based on our current Nexus fee study. Sunset has committed to paying 50% of that fee prior to the first building permit, and then 50% prior to the issuance of the 600th building permit, which is about 5 to 6 years into the project. So this is almost an upfront payment to the city of $3.3 million of our open space fee. And the open space fee is used to acquire open space and construct trails. So back on September 23rd, we took to the Parks and Community Services Commission the park credit to discuss it with them and get their input on it. So overall, the commission agreed that the city green should receive 100% credit because it was requested of the city early on in the project, and Sunset agreed to provide the city green. They agreed that partial credit for the bikeways comprising the walking district, with the exception of the sidewalk and bike lane, should be constructed. And they agreed that partial credit for the Lake Annabelle and Cecilia Lake should be provided also. They asked that we accelerate the building of those offsite parks on the west side, and they requested input into the design of the parks and programming the city green and lakes, and agreed on the accelerated open space fee payment that Sunset has offered. While not consensus on the park credit was reached, but consistent with the comments from the Parks Commission, we went back and took their comments to heart and said, okay, how can we work with this 48% park credit? And so what we came up with is that the city green would receive the 100% credit that they had requested or were supportive of. The parkways, we are looking at about an 84% credit, or about 8.8 acres, accounting for a 10-foot reduction to accommodate the sidewalks and bike lanes. And if you recall, the parkway surrounds all of 2600 and is a part of the walking district, so we'll have a high public access component. The neighborhood parks are about 20% or 2 acres, and we did this because the Parks Commission has requested and Sunset agreed to provide input on design and the programming of the park. So in order for the city to have input on the design of a park and have ability to help program it, there should be some fee credit, in our opinion, given for that. Lake Annabelle and Cecilia Lake are about 23% credit, or about 5.9 acres. And then above all of this, there is an additional 1.7 acres of parkland that gets us to the 40.35 acres. That's the total project, what Sunset will be providing as far as CITYWALK, which is above the 38.65 that's required for the additional residents that will be built within CITYWALK. So Sunset has agreed to the following modifications. Accelerate construction of the offsite parks. So the wood lot would be built at the 450th permit versus 935. Iron Horse Middle School turf field at 1250 permit, and a Henry Ranch at the 1600th building permit. And they also agreed, as I mentioned, to review the park designs and programming the parks, including the lakes and the city green with the city. So I want to kind of bring us back to the totality of the agreement. I know I spent a lot of time talking about the park credit because it is important and there's a lot of moving parts to it. But really, when I start off my presentation, I asked the commission to think about the development agreement in its totality, because that's really what we're looking at. What's the value the city is getting from the project, not just one component of the negotiation, but the overall value of this agreement. And so essentially, at the end of the day, we're receiving a $36.7 million of constructed parks. City's cost of $73.3 million would be our cost to construct those, which is a value added by about $36 million to the city. The $8.8 million of offsite constructed parks, $6.15 in park fees, the $3.3 million in the accelerated open space fee payment, and then Sunset's is taking on the annual parks maintenance and at about $450,000 per year of their own costs, which, as I mentioned earlier, was not part of the negotiation and not taken into account. We were going through all the park fee credits. As I mentioned earlier, with the sales tax being remitted directly to the city for construction, that averages about $200,000 annually. If approved, the Bishop Ranch Fourth Amendment, we could see about a $4.6 million increase in our annual property tax annually, about $1.7 million in sales tax, and $1.9 million, oh, I'm sorry, 1.7, that should be TOT tax, and 1.9 in sales tax annually. Overall, at the end of the day, if the Fourth Amendment is approved, the city will see an overall benefit of about $1.4 million net fiscal income to the general fund after city services are taken out. City's costs have been addressed. So at this point, we would recommend that you receive the staff report, accept public comment, discuss, deliberate, Adopt the resolutions, be recommended approval to the city council with the following. The development agreements as negotiated, retaining the 48% park credit. Accelerate the construction of the offsite parks as agreed to by Sunset. City review of the park design and programming events at the parks to include Lake Annabelle and City Green. And then also, this was the last minute catch on my part. The term in the agreement was originally noted at 25 years. Our ordinance allows a max of 15 years, but we can include extensions as part of the agreement, which is what we have done. We did it with the Free of Preserve agreement that was adopted in 2007, and we've done it with past agreements through the city. So we're recommending that the term, it'll still be 25 years, but it's a maximum of 15 years with one automatic 10-year extension. And so with that, I'm providing some guidance for the discussion, and Chair Wallace has had these questions to help facilitate your discussion tonight. The goal is to focus on the overall benefit of the agreement to the city. And so the questions that we're looking for input on, or the direction, the guidance for your discussion really is the DA consistent with the general plan and the zoning? Are the benefits negotiated reasonable, fair, and equitable under the circumstances support the term? Does the agreement promote the health, safety, and general welfare? Provide sufficient benefit to the community to justify entering into the agreement? And does it have a positive effect on the orderly development of property or preservation of neighborhood values? So with that, I know that Jerry Ingen from Sunset Development and Patricia Curtin are on the meeting and would like to be promoted in now.
I have promoted them both.
I'm in. Can you hear me?
We hear you, Jerry. Patty's still muted, so I don't know which
That's okay.
tag team approach you're going to take. But
Okay, no problem. Good evening, Chair Wallace and members of the commission. As you know, my name is Jerry Ingen, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Development and Construction for Sunset Development. It's good to be before you and see you all again this evening. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you tonight on the proposed development agreement. I believe staff did a great job on presenting all the issues embodied in this agreement, especially the most complicated element, which is the concerning how we are complying with the condition of approval regarding the parks. I do want to provide some high-level context from our point of view on how we approach this and what was on our mind and approach around the park credits mostly. Just like the overall master plan, we did not take the approach for asking for the moon so that we can negotiate and settle somewhere in the middle. That is not how we approach our long-term partnership in this city. We first listened to all the stakeholders to understand the varied points of views. We designed a project that struck a balance between our desires and vision and those of the stakeholders. And I feel, given the unanimous support of this body and the council and the great public support, that we were successful in doing that. As you know, and as Debbie pointed out clearly, that we really were only obligated to pay $49 million in fees. And that was a basis from where we began. But we do know and agree, I think, that if all we did was pay fees and didn't build parks, would not be the best outcome for any of us. From day one, we felt, and those of the stakeholders that we talked to, that parks were and open space were a critical component of the plan. We're providing a wonderful variety of publicly accessible park space totaling 40 acres, not only for this community, new community, but for the city as a whole. These parks and this master plan will be the envy of other cities and a benchmark for infill development. It will be a source of pride for the city, its residents, and Sunset. Accordingly, we believe we should be getting 100% credit for these parks. It's important to remember that these parks are not Sunset's parks. These residents that will be living here will not just be Sunset residents. They will be the city of San Ramon residents and parks, not unlike any other neighborhood throughout this city. Getting a partial credit is like you selling your house to the city or having it condemned to turn it into a museum or community center, but not getting its full value. I'm sure that wouldn't feel very good to you. However, we are a part of this community and we understand the importance of striking a fair balance. So providing 40 acres of parks that the city can count all 40 acres in its compliance with the goals of the general plan. And that would cost the city $76 million to acquire and build for only receiving 36 million in credit to our obligation seems more than fair. Additionally, building 3 offsite parks, still paying additional impact fees that in total is valued at 52 million seems like a fair and balanced deal. So we reviewed the staff report. We take no exceptions. Patty Curtin, as was mentioned, our land use attorney, is here, and I'm here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Ms. Curtin, go ahead. The floor is yours.
She's going to answer questions should any legal things come up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just here to answer any questions, but I'd certainly like to commend your staff on an excellent job in negotiating the terms of the development agreement. They worked extremely hard, and in every part of the negotiation, they had the city's best interest at heart, and really want to thank them for their time.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have public comment. I would hope that Mr. Engen and Ms. Curtin will hang around, because there may be a few questions of them after the public has finished commenting. And if staff has any cleanup questions following public comment, we can do that at that time. So at that point, I am going to open the public comment. And would our recording secretary, Ms. Shaw, please advise the public as to the terms and conditions of public comment on this particular item?
Sure. Prior to opening public comment to audience members, I would like to acknowledge having received written communication items from the following people. From Greenfire Law on behalf of Jim Blick and staff, raising concerns with the parks and open space impact and dedication fees, the affordable housing linkage fee and other impact fees, and with the amount of affordable housing constructed, as well as concerns with the implementation of the EIR and traffic mitigation. And from Luz Gomez commenting on the police substation, parks, the open space fee payment, the economic and fiscal impact analysis, project and zoning changes, permitted uses, inclusionary housing, density, funding of city services, and other terms and conditions outlined in the development agreement. All comments have been provided to the Planning Commission in advance of tonight's meeting. For anyone else wishing to speak on item 10.1, you may do so now by pressing the raise your hand button on your computer screen or *9 on your telephone. When it is your turn to make your comment, you will have 3 minutes to speak. Okay, so first hand is Joyce Carr. I will unmute you.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm Joyce Carr, citizen here of San Ramon for many years. I have a very big concern about the traffic that this is going to cause. And I've spoken about this before, but I wanted to bring it up again tonight. The traffic coming from Norris Canyon heading west, and then it meets San Ramon Valley Boulevard. If it keeps going west, Norris Canyon continues into a neighborhood with driveways that actually, face Norris Canyon. And I'm wondering what kind of situation this is going to cause for people living in that neighborhood, because it is a neighborhood. It's not a commercial area. It is a neighborhood. I happen to live near that neighborhood, and I see people walking all the time. I see kids walking to school, whatever. What does Norris Canyon at San Ramon Valley Boulevard and then continuing west on Norris Canyon look like in this project? Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
Next is Luz Gomez.
Good evening, everyone. This is Luz Gomez. I'm a longtime resident of San Ramon. I do have some really good comments about agreement, especially I was pleased to see the development of the Woodlot and Henry Ranch into parks. Thank you for that. And I did have a few concerns that, as you saw in my letter, I outlined. But tonight I also wanted to talk a little bit about the community engagement portion of things. I happen to live close enough to the project to have received one of the yellow notices of this hearing, but the rest of the city doesn't live that close. And I just keep wishing that somehow the city would make a slightly effort to let more residents know hearings like this one are happening. Other than that, I think I will just leave it to you all to read my comments regarding everything from the project changes and how they're approved to whether or not there would be a subsequent environmental impact report, and whether or not there are sufficient benefits to the city. I want to highlight a little bit that given COVID and given that the financial report analysis was finished right before COVID hit, that I would like to see some additional funding coming to the city, small businesses, as we come out of the pandemic. So I think I will leave it at that for tonight. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Ms. Shaw, do you have any other hands raised, or?
That's it.
That's it?
All we have.
Going once, going twice. Public comments closed. First of all, I'm going to let Mr. Engen and Ms. Curtin, if you feel you want to make a response to any of the public comments, go for it.
I've read the responses from Green Fire. I've read Ms. Gomez's comments and listened to Joyce and understand their concerns. Although for Joyce Carr, the traffic issues were dealt with as part of the master plan and EIR process and approval. We're really dealing with the development agreement tonight. And so I know those have all been addressed previously. As to Green Fire's comments, I think the city is going to address that. Many of those comments make assumptions that are not accurate. So I'll just let the city staff address that, and we'll chime in if there's anything that was missed.
Okay, Ms. Curtin, I know that lawyers never like not to have the last word, so I'm opening up the floor to you in case you really want to talk to us.
I do. I just have a 15-minute presentation. So I'm only kidding. No, Jerry said it beautifully. I have nothing else to add, and staff's staff report was thorough enough. So unless you have specific questions, I'm just here to answer. How's that?
Okay, I'm going to allow the commissioners, if they have any questions of either Mr. Engen or Ms. Curtin. I don't see any hands raised or brows furrowed. Commissioner Alpert?
Jerry, hi, thank you for my question. And maybe it's one that maybe I didn't quite understand. At one point it talked about, I think it was Exhibit I, not building the community center on BR1A, and then someplace else we talked about an Annabelle Lake Community Center. Are they one and the same?
No.
Or are they different ones? No, they are not.
They're different.
Okay.
Right.
So there's still one on the lake and there's
Yes.
a different one on BR1A. Okay, great. Thank
Right.
you for clarifying.
Any other commissioners have questions for either Mr. Engen or Ms. Curtin? Seeing none, Ms. Chamberlain, do you want to sort of wind up the discussion and direct any comments to either the applicant's comments or those that were raised during public comment?
I can briefly respond to a couple of the comments in the Green Fire letter. There are about 4 that relate to the development agreement. Some relate to the project approval that's already been done and the EIR certified. So regarding that the project is required to comply with the Quimby Act and dedication, it's not. Our parkland ordinance does not apply to rental units. Through our Nexus fee study adopted in 2017, those projects only required to fee out. Really up until 2017, we did not charge park fees on non-subdivision projects, so rental projects. So part of the key component of that Nexus study was, and it stated in the study, was it to have it applied to a non-subdivision or a rental project. I have discussed with Sunset a couple of the comments, and it was noted that on what the exhibit that discusses city impact fees, that one fee with the inclusionary and linkage fee was missing. Sunset does know they do need to pay those fees. And so we're going to do a memorialize that all fees that are required to be paid as the day of the vesting in the project. We'll do a catch-all statement. So we ensure that those aren't, it's not inclusive. So there may be others that aren't listed, but we will ensure that all fees will be paid and document in the agreement that they're paid at the time of permit issuance per the fee resolution in place at the time the project was vested. So we'll clean that up for you. And also Sunset has agreed, there was some confusion or concern that some of the affordable units may not be constructed in CITYWALK, constructed offsite or even out of the city. So Sunset has committed that all affordable units will be constructed within the boundaries of CITYWALK. So we will make that amendment to the agreement somewhere. And then, as I noted in my presentation, there is no inflationary adjustment for the open space impact fee. It is a maximum of $750 per unit and will remain that way until the city does conduct a new Nexus fee study, which we don't have plans in the near future for that right now. So I can answer any further questions that you may have.
Does any of the commissioners have any questions for Ms. Chamberlain?
I actually might have a few, since we're talking about Mr. Blickenstaff's council's letter. Debbie, I don't know if you just covered this. You went pretty fast there, and I think I got it all. And the good news is that you answered some questions that I already had. One of the questions raised in the letter is the application of a cap at the of 15% on the credit that's allowed for parks in San Ramon Municipal Code C5-148. Can you comment on that?
I certainly can. So that's a credit for private open space, meaning if an HOA owns open space next to their development and they have a trail system, the city, if they want to, can give a 15% credit for that private open space that's accessible to that residential community and maintained by that residential community. In the case of Sunset Development, they are making the parks available to the public. And so the park is a completely different negotiation, a completely different fee structure. And through the development agreement, we have the ability to negotiate a different park credit because these are publicly open and available spaces. They're not privately held and privately used.
May I add one thing to that?
Yes.
That 15% credit also only would apply if it was being subject to Quimby. That's where that rule applies, and our project is not subject to Quimby.
All right, thank you for that. Another question I had was related to, we've got, regarding the offsite parks, there's a cap amount of 6 million and change, 6,135,000 and change, I think. That's capped at, I guess, $2020. There's no indexing for inflation on that number that I saw, unless I misread it. Whereas there are some other areas where we are indexing for inflation. And so I was wondering what the thought process was, why we differentiated, why that's a hard cap, especially when these parks, for example, just based on the Exhibit E phasing schedule, for example, the turf field, the turf on Iron Horse is scheduled not to be done until like 2030-ish about. So I just don't know what value we're going to get, 10 years from now based on the hard cap on that. So I was wondering what the reasoning was and why there wasn't a tie to inflation on that one.
Okay, so just to note, based on the recommendation from the Parks Commission last week, 2 weeks ago, the offsite parks have been accelerated. So the phasing and amenity program in the DA you have will be updated to reflect the Park and Recreation Commission's recommendation to the Planning Commission, if so desired by the Commission. So what basically we went into negotiation. So the offsite park costs of the Woodlot, Henry, and Iron Horse is about $8.8 million. And so we relied on the Kaiser Marston fee study to have a basis for negotiation using the City Council adopted fee studies, that basis, and that a construction cost, that are city construction cost, to have a point of negotiation and to set, a value to that. At this point, neither park is programmed. And so we're not sure what the program of those parks will look like. Additionally, those parks aren't just for the benefit of the CITYWALK residents, they're a community-wide benefit. And there will be additional projects coming in, residential projects, that will be contributing to the park fund also. So basically that 8.8 is what was agreed upon to be contributed to construction of those parks. And then if there are additional costs, that would be on the city to contribute to. And if you recall from the final deal, the value, Sunset's park obligation was valued at $49.3 million, and the final value we negotiated was $51.7 million. And then we did, and then the park impact fee, we did adjust that every 5 years for inflation. So that fee will go up by about $17,000 to $20,000 over the life of the project in totality. And typically that fee would be locked in place, but Sunset agreed to escalate that fee. And those park fees can also be used to help construct these offsite parks also.
One other question. I'm paring down my list because I have a feeling that I may not be the only one asking questions. Then we have a comment period later, but there are a lot of assumptions based on what it would cost the city to acquire and build, I should say, the 38.65 acres of 73 million. But I wanted to make sure I understood that assumes that the city has to acquire all 38.65 acres. Is that not correct?
That is correct. And so as we've been, talking about the new arena cycle coming around, we have to find, housing units too. So we have these competing interests, but recognizing that Sunset does not have an obligation to dedicate land, only to fee out per our code. The city is on the hook to go find land and acquire and construct those 38.65 acres of parkland.
Okay, do we have any idea? For example, we apparently already own the property for those two, Woodlot and Henry Ranch Park. Does the city not already own that land?
We do own those, but those are already in our general plan build out to meet our 6.5 acres per thousand. This is new net parkland that we would need to acquire to accommodate the additional growth from CityWalk.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. That's all I have on the Q&A part.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Alford.
Just sort of to follow, just to make sure I understood, the 6.1 million on the Exhibit I, it says it's adjusted for inflation, is what the sentence says. And then in the staff report, I think it's followed up on the paragraph. It says 3% rate, adjusted 3% rate of inflation. Are those the same? They talk about the same thing in the staff report on page 15. It says 3%. Then the attachment I, it doesn't say 3%, but I'm sort of making the assumption that the plan is to adjust that at 3%, or is there some index that the intent is to use? It just wasn't clear on Exhibit I that the intent is 3%, or is the intent that we'll pick some index and use that when we adjust it every 5 years?
No, it's so when we did basically the math on taking out the 36.7 million of the credit and then taking out the 8.8 million, the balance, the balance was 6.135, if I recall. And, in talking with Sunset, I said, we need to, have an escalator for that fee every 5 years. So we do get some additional value added to that fee over the life of the project to help with some of these, future park costs because that fee goes citywide. It goes to the Park Development Fund. And so the 6.15 would be the approximate estimated total payment at the end of the project.
So I get all that. I'm just trying to get the arithmetic. So every 5 years it'll be adjusted by some amount. I'm just trying to get, is it a flat 3% every 5 years, or is it, oh, okay, it is. Jerry, you said, okay. And I just was calling out that it was a little bit vague on, because sometimes people like to tie it to the T-bill rate, to this rate, to that rate, and it just was unclear in the document. So, you know, the staff report's clear, it says 3%. The exhibit, which is the contract, is unclear. But Jerry, I think you answered my question. It's a flat 3% every 5 years, you know, got it. Thank you. Thank you. That helps.
We can take a look at that language too, just to make sure.
Yeah. That's fine. That's all. That's all. Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay, that was my question.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Either Commissioner Kuznick or Commissioner Marks? Commissioner Marks says no. Commissioner Kuznick, yes.
Well, I have comments, but not questions. So
Okay,
I didn't know if we were ready to launch into the discussion portion.
No, the launch has been postponed until after we finish the questions. So.
Okay.
All right. So there being no further questions from the commissioners, now it's discussion time. Who wants to go first?
I will go.
Kuznick, you will.
Thank
Okay.
you. Yes, and I even took the time to type up my remarks because I wanted this to be thoughtful and deliberative and making sure that I covered the points that I think are important to this. And I would just like to say, as I start here, that, you know, two things struck me as I was trying to make sense of all this. Number one is we use the word unprecedented a lot. And, you know, certainly I think it's one of those words that needs to die with 2020, but nevertheless, a lot of has been happening, including this project. I think it's unprecedented in the scale and scope and vision and forward thinking that we've seen in the year and a half, 2 years, as it has been presented to us. And so I want to acknowledge that it's a phenomenal project. I love what it will do for the city. And I just, you know, that even in the variety of meetings I've sat in, I have expressed my support in this. Now, I will say, however, that in calculating this, you know, we are trying to balance housing needs, quality of life, traffic, all those kinds of things. And so one of the things that it really concerns me about this project is that we got 800 pages of documents on Friday to review before this meeting. And so that is of concern to me. I'm not sure that we were given an adequate time to really ingest all the information and to do justice. But really, as both a former Parks Commissioner and now a Planning Commissioner, I have some concerns about this development agreement relating to the parks. And it took me a long time to come to a way to understand that is both explainable, logical, and represents, I hope, the interest of people who are listening and people who aren't part of this meeting, but are citizens of San Ramon. So one of the things that's important to be reminded is that this is going to span 27 years. That's a long time. So we have to get this right now. There isn't a do-over. And that concerns me, and I want to be faithful and due diligence on this. But I disagree with the concept of the park credit. And I spent a lot of time trying to calculate a way to understand this. And this is how I came up with it. If you take the idea that Sunset has agreed to improve Woodlot, Henry Ranch, and then the turf for $8.8 million, that's using the number of $325,000 per acre. I've done the math repeatedly. I'm good on that. And that is because the city already owns the land. Now, this is a key point for me in how I looked at the rest of this agreement. If you take all the land that we are crediting Sunset with, they already own it. In fact, they've owned it for a very long time. So when we're calculating value, I'm happy to agree that construction cost at $329,000 per acre should be agreed upon. There are a number of parks that are in this. The numbers have changed a little bit from when I started reading this, from the Parks Commission numbers to these, and then your presentation today, Debbie, in the PowerPoint. But I think my numbers are pretty solid. If we agree that the cost should only be on what it costs to construct it, I'm giving credit for the 7.3 acres of parks and 8.8 acres for the parkways. That puts us at 16.1. Now, times the 329,000 comes up with a we'll round it up. It's $5,296,900. I'll give it to you at 5.3. Okay. So for this 16.1 acres, that's going to be turned into dirt today, park later, I calculate that's a 5.3 million investment. If you add into that the 8.8 that's been agreed to because of the Woodlot, Iron Horse Middle School synthetic turf, and Henry Ranch, that's the 8.8, then that number comes up to 14,000 or 14 million. Now, these are current dollars and they don't reflect any loss in value over time, like we talked about. So the question then is, well, what is the difference between the obligation of 49.3 million and this 14.113700 that I calculated? And the answer is $35.2 million. Now, that is an enormous amount of money for the city to essentially say, well, we're giving you credit for it. And I don't see how your reckoning of the benefit matches my reckoning of the investment. Now, what I didn't include in my acreage is the acreage for the two lakes. And that logic is simple, and I think speaks to the realities of the development, the whole project. Lake Cecilia and Lake Annabelle exist. They have for a long time. I'm sure Sunset could tell us when they put those in. They were added as an amenity to a business park. The fact that they're still there and will be allowed to walk around them is nice, but it's not a new construction. The city is not going to get ownership of it. My guess is that the Sunset has written this off as a business expense as part of their asset for a long time. This is to give them credit for this as new is overly generous in my opinion. Finally, part of asking, the 35 million, I think it's fair to say that the construction of these parks, as on the document that we got, the diagram, was part of our approval of the project. They can't just decide not to do them. We approved the project with those as part of what we approved. So I would task our staff to go back and say, wait a minute, will the lake be lovely? Absolutely. I'm really excited to be able to take the grandkids there as soon as COVID allows us a little more freedom. The parkway, the pathways around, we use it already as part of our fitness routine. The parks that would put into the neighborhoods will be nice, but that is also a credit for Sunset's value because they're taking useless asphalt and they're converting it into a piece of property that has value to them. Now, it has value to us as a city, but not in the $2 million range that you want us to give them credit for it. So as I tried to reconcile this with what I read in the development agreement, with how I look at this, this was the linchpin in my thinking. And I think most of the citizens would agree that to put $35 million on a credit is a lot to ask our citizens. It says that, no, we can put off all these other things because there's going to be a nice lake. And so I think it's really important, and I'm trying to not, you know, fall into, you know, some of my school teacher habits here, but I do think it's important to explain how I got to those numbers and what I think about it. And I do think it's really important that when we look at this agreement, it's not just for the people who will live at 2,600, it's for everybody. The numbers have to work out for people who live here now, but they also have to work out for the people who will come in 20 years. And so I would just say that, you know, Sunset has indicated that they're open to the idea of paying open space fees up front. And so I think that we need to reevaluate the amount of credit that we're giving and how that works out in this analysis. My husband, I was talking to him about this, and he sat down and started writing a pie chart. So one was the 6 million that was going to be the leftover to pay in cash, the 8.8 for Woodlot, Henry Ranch, and the synthetic turf. And he goes, well, what's the rest? And I said, well, that's the park credit. And he goes, that's a really big chunk of this pie. And when you look at it that way, we have to be able to say to the citizens of San Ramon that we didn't give it away, that we're getting value. And I would say that, you know, I hope I can get my fellow commissioners to really ask staff to go back and really work this through one more time. And again, I think that the distinction is land that they already own, they're obligated to develop because that's what we agreed to, and credit for as if this was brand new land, and we'd have to find it. That's not our responsibility. That's the city's responsibility. Our responsibility is to make this a good deal. And that's what I'm asking for people to consider in how they look at this. So, thank you.
Okay, other commissioners? You're muted, Rick. There you go.
I said if nobody else wants to go, I will go.
Okay, you're elected.
Like Gina, I also want to start off by saying that I voted for the CITYWALK mixed-use master plan because I think it's a good development plan and strategy, not only for San Ramon, but for the Tri-Valley housing and job market, which we are a part of. However, what's before the Planning Commission tonight is a separate and distinct request regarding the appropriate expenditure and amount of expenditure of public funds. The request before the Commission does not regard a negotiated settlement of a dispute where both parties to the dispute each have rights and thereby settle their disagreement. The proposed agreements before us are the result of a negotiation regarding public funds that are exclusively the city's, and the decision regarding how and where to expend them should be based on whether and how the agreements serve the overall best interests of the city's current residents, its future residents, and the public recreation and public park system. While I support the CITYWALK mixed-use master plan and the housing and other land uses that it will generate, I have serious concerns regarding the business terms that are included in this set of development agreements. I have several concerns that I want to share with you tonight regarding why I have those concerns. And one of the concerns I had, which I will not go into because I thought Jean did a very good job of it, was how property has been valued, property that is owned by Sunset and has been valued at today's values. The first thing I want to talk about is the general plan. We have some resolutions that are before us that state that the project is general plan compliant. That's what we're asked to adopt. Every element of the general plan has equal weight with any other element of a general plan. So the land use plan does not dominate the rest of the plan. In fact, it's one of several, one of probably 7 mandated. To be compliant with the general plan, a proposal must be compliant with all elements of the plan. I don't see any general plan 2035 authorization or any ability to adopt findings of general plan compliance for approving, accepting, or obtaining access to grass areas, no matter how attractive, and calling them neighborhood parks. Section 6.2, Park Classifications and Standards of the Parks and Recreation element, specifically states that a neighborhood park is at least 2 acres in size, developed primarily to meet the recreational needs of citizens living within a half-mile radius of the park. As proposed, the areas that the CITYWALK Master Plan defines as neighborhood parks on page 14 of the adopted development application package, and in the information that we saw tonight, say that those parks, those 5 parks, range in size from 0.6 acres to 1.5 acres, none of which meet the 2-acre standard, and they do not provide for a range of recreational opportunities. Only City Green Park, which I support giving full funding for, only that meets the acreage, but at least at this time, no recreational facilities are included or described. While the general plan encourages public-private partnerships, I'm not aware of any authorization for encouraging undersized parks with little or no defined park facilities. One only needs to take a look at a modern-day San Ramon Park in the Doherty Valley to know what a modern-day neighborhood park has and should have. And specifically, I asked during the workshops of one of the staff of Sunset what facilities were included in these parks, and I was told they were grassy areas. With regard to public spaces, which is really what the walking district is going to be a part of, as I understand it, Section 6.2, Park Classification and Standards of the Parks and Recreation element defines public spaces as spaces developed to enhance the recreation or leisure interactive experience of residents in mixed-use developments or multifamily developments or visitors for passive or active use. Public spaces might include an interactive water element, public art, gardens, trails, paths, plazas, labyrinths, picnic areas, tot lots, pocket parks, and a variety of other things. My concern is that the proposed external pathway along Camino Ramon is intended to become a part of the walking district, connecting various properties in the city along an attractive, pedestrian-friendly, publicly accessible landscape system. But the development agreement should define the minimum facilities and facility locations to be included and maintained in the park, in the walking district, including public plazas, consistent with page 13 of the City Center Mixed Use Master Plan Development Application Package and page 7 Parkway System of the adopted CITYWALK Bishop Ranch Design Guidelines. In short, I'm not saying design these items now, but define what's going to be in them. If indeed the city chooses to give $36 million worth of credit, it at least ought to know what it is getting, other than the ability at a later date to work with Sunset to define them. My next area of concern is, what is the impact of giving $36,718,000 worth of public funds to on-site open spaces and existing facilities within the master plan area, What will be the impact on the city's ability to fund the improvements listed in the recommendation summary in the Parks, Trails, Open Space, and Recreation Master Plan? I listened to the Parks and Recreation meeting the other day, and one of the items that came up with for funding was grants. Grants are a very uncertain basis for obtaining funding. And if they were a good and reliable source of funding, I have to ask why in the last 30 years that I've lived in San Ramon, aren't the Woodlot and Henry Ranch parks already built? The next source of funding could be perhaps bonded indebtedness. The city would sell bonds to fund what's in the Parks Master Plan. After awarding $36 million worth of funding to assist the development plan proposal, it's curious to me why the city would then assume whatever debt would ensue. And would the public agree that selling bonds for parks, trails, and open space made sense, given what we've already done with the first $36 million? It doesn't seem likely to me. The next possible source of funding that I can identify is the park and recreation facility impact fees from other development projects, perhaps from the Crow Canyon specific plan area. But we would only have access to them after they meet their own park generated obligations, and that doesn't seem like a likely remainder. The last and worst possible source of funding is the city general fund. And given all the other increasing demands on the general fund and the current and continuing decrease in city sales tax collection, that doesn't seem likely. I'm also concerned that the city encouraged the public to spend time participating in surveys and attending meetings to produce a plan that met their needs and desires. And I just don't see how do we justify not using all, or at least a very substantial portion of the $49 million in park and recreation impact fees to fund what the public advised us that they wanted the city to fund, and spend their time assisting the city Parks and Community Services Commission in developing. I ask myself, what's the unstated message to the public? And the next time we ask for their participation, how likely are we to get it? Another area of concern I have regards the costs for constructing the woodlot and the Henry Ranch and the timing. Some of the information we were given was that the park improvements and construction costs were established in the Kaiser Marston Impact Fee Study conducted in 2017 and resulted in $329,000 per acre for park development. The costs are capped at $8,816,000 based on that study, and they do not include design costs. Park development is based on building permit issuance at various times, and while those times have improved based on what the Parks and Community Services Commission recommended, from 935th building permit for the woodlot to 450, and the Henry Ranch from the 1900th to the 1600th, my concern is that we're using 2017 cost estimates, and we're here in 2020. And if you take a look at the best guess, at least that I could come up with, when the Henry Ranch, or I should say when the woodlot might get funding, that's at least another 3 years out. So I ran a worksheet on inflation costs at 2% over 6 years. And what starts at $329,000 in 2017, by the time you get to 2023, which again, I think is the likely earliest time for getting the funding for just that one area, you're at $370,518 per acre. And if you go out and do the math for the Henry Ranch and you go out the out years for that, the capped $8 million, it seems to me is a risk. It seems to me it's putting the city at risk for, yes, we can build the first park that we do, which I'm assuming would be woodlot, but it's uncertain whether there's going to be funding enough for the turf field when its turn comes at the 1250th building permit, and the Henry Ranch after that. Further, I don't agree that design costs should be borne by the city. I think those are not insignificant costs, and they are enough to tip the scale. It's not even clear to me how the $8 million was arrived at relative to what amenities and facilities are assumed to be in the Henry Ranch Park or in the woodlot. And I wonder who did the cost estimating. I just want to make a note that when we get to resolution 1720, the changes in building permit construction time in Exhibit I are not updated. We're still talking about 935th building permit, the 1900th building permit, and those numbers need to be changed if we're going to accept the changes that came out of the Parks Commission. I think City Green, again, is a park that I can get behind putting funding in, but I think we need to find out what facilities are going to be in it. If it's just another grassy field, for me, that's problematic. So I think the development agreement should define, not design, but define the minimum type of facilities that must be included in the Woodlot Park, the Henry Ranch Park, and City Green Park, and require accelerated timing for their design and construction beyond what the proposal currently includes. I also think that there is a smarter way to go about doing this. And we have some very excellent examples right here in San Ramon. Years ago, when the Doherty Valley was being planned, our public school district worked with the developers out there. And instead of the school district using the public bidding process to build the schools, the developers built the schools. The public bidding process tends to inflate the cost of doing anything we do and accelerate the time frame in which to do it. The developers out there were able to build the schools at a much cheaper cost using city, or I should say public school district standards. Here in town, we have a great example of our city hall, which was built by Sunset. And again, if we were to have built the city hall, my expectation is through the public bidding process, we would have spent more money and likely would not have been able to get it done as satisfactorily or on time the way they were. And so I think what we ought to do is that whatever the trigger is for when they are obligated to fund these parks, pass the cost of design and construction off to them. I suspect it will be cheaper than what we are talking about here, given their experience in hiring contractors, monitoring the work, and designing things. But even if the city should adopt the development agreements that talk about $8 million, capping the total and not including the design costs, to me is a non-starter. I'd also like to say that if the city should decide to accept Sunset's proposal to construct privately owned, publicly accessible parks, it seems to me that the development agreements should define the rights and obligations of both parties. Putting things off into the future is, for me, at least, not what I expect to get in a contract. A contract is where both parties or the multiple parties lay out what their expectations and obligations are, and there's no dispute downstream, particularly as staff may change or as the times may change, or as costs get to a point that one party feels they can't bear the cost. I think that the development agreements ought to specifically talk about maintenance responsibilities and standards. And while I understand that Sunset has accepted the general maintenance obligations, there are other maintenance obligations. For instance, what would be the city's programming rights within the parks and the maintenance obligations after that? Again, at the Park and Recreation the Park and Community Services Commission meeting, the question came up about what kind of programming could we do? And the answer was, we've always had a great relationship with Sunset. We'll be able to work it out. That's not what you do in a contract. especially when you're giving $36 million to one party. You don't say, we'll figure out later on what we get and what our rights and obligations are. I think the agreement ought to call out the hours of the day and the week and the legal holidays that the parks are available for public use. I think that the type and scheduling of special uses or special events needs to be discussed, either sponsored by Sunset or sponsored by the city. Replacement of or changes to initially approved facilities, design and landscaping. How is that going to be handled? Who makes that decision? For each of the proposed park and the walking district areas, define the amenities that are going to be there and that constitute a typical modern San Ramon public park. And that by that, I'm talking about children's play areas, sports fields, basketball courts, bocce courts, horseshoe pits, tennis courts, volleyball courts, all-weather walking paths, benches. Nowhere in the plans that I saw in the past did I even see a public restroom in the area. And for those of us who have raised young children, you know very well that you ask everybody to use the restroom before they leave, and 5 minutes after they get there, they need to use the restroom. I also want to say that with Lake Annabelle, if it's approved for some kind of credit, the hours and days of the week that the boats will be available for public use, what kind of boats, how many, what's the cost likely to start at? People have asked me, will there be a public launch area for privately owned kayaks and canoes, not motorized boats, but road boats? I want to also say that with regard to something that is not a park issue, that I'm disappointed in the section 6.3 regarding inclusionary housing. I do not think it is acceptable to say that this obligation can be met with fees or an alternative plan for providing the housing. This whole 4,500 housing unit development was predicated on the notion that the businesses in this area need housing for their employees. Employees who are back office employees, frontline employees, restaurant employees, teachers, firefighters, police officers. Collecting fees does not produce units. In fact, the fees often get siphoned off for other worthy uses, but they don't produce units. I've looked at this as, at a minimum, we're going to get 675 actual housing units. And I'm not prepared to support a development agreement that allows any other way of meeting this obligation other than units in San Ramon in this project. Further, I have to say that everything I've seen in the past about our affordable housing obligations to date, how we have met them, that we're behind the curve. If we don't increase that number from above 675, how and where are we ever going to catch up? How and where, given that we are so substantially built out, are we ever going to make any kind of a meaningful dent in our backlog of affordable and workforce housing? I just don't see it. And if I'm missing opportunity sites that are real, I'm open to hearing that. But it just seems to me that given all that Sunset is requesting, an increase in the number of units the way they are, it's not out of line for the city to seek more than the minimum number of affordable housing units. I want to go back to something that, some things that are in the agreement that are not talked about in the staff report, and that in my experience with development agreements are worth substantial value, financial value to the recipient of a development agreement that includes them. I want to go back into our own history, and Debbie touched on this a little bit. After the decision by the city to remove housing from the various shopping centers last year, based on a recommendation in our retail analysis, and with Sunset's cooperation, and I acknowledge that, we placed hundreds of potential residential units in the city center. well before the request to review or approve the CITYWALK development or master plan was reviewed by the city. That adds value to what they had before. Rezoning their property to mixed use to allow what are now non-revenue generating and substantially unused at-grade parking lots or undeveloped property to host the 4,500 units creates substantial value. Even the CEQA process, the tiering process that we went through, will expedite the review of site-specific projects as they come in, beyond what would be the case if we didn't do an overall master plan environmental review. City actions have resulted in the property becoming more marketable to other housing developers as expensive fees are capped or subject to limited increases over time, and the environmental review process is faster. Developers typically try to incorporate a provision in a development agreement that exempts the property owner now or in the future, or their assigns, from being subject to any new development related or new city ordinances or fees, with the exception perhaps of state mandates that affect the proposed development. And section 6.1 of this agreement is one such section. The land development entitlements included in and defined by the development agreements bring long-term certainty to the current or future property owners and avoid and minimize a lengthy review process. They eliminate the uncertainty of a possible future new or amended ordinance affecting the land, or a future city council trying to amend or deny the entitlements that are included in the development agreement for the entire term of the agreement. If all or a substantial number of just the items I listed were incorporated into the proposed 3 development agreements, and even if the city awarded no financial value to Sunset for their proposed amenities, the city would have awarded very substantial value in land marketability and entitlement protections and fee protection to the developer. And I have seen development agreements that only include those kinds of things and don't deal with park issues as we are looking at it. I think that the additional request for $36 million of the $49 million, in other words, 74%, capping the construction costs off and passing off the design costs for the woodlot and the Henry Ranch awards too much value for the facilities that were constructed decades ago or are repetitive of existing facilities. And by that, I'm referencing the amphitheater. We have an amphitheater in Central Park. It creates too lopsided a business deal that favors Sunset development to the disadvantage of the city, and in my opinion, does very little to benefit the overall public park system or the overall San Ramon public. I can see the public coming there sometimes, but I have to say, I find it difficult if we were to approve what is being asked, that on a Sunday afternoon in the summer, a family with a couple of children says, let's go down to CITYWALK and take advantage of the mini parks that don't have any facilities in them, at least as we know now, and spend the day. I think people would not do that very often. They might use the lake. They might use, and they will use, I think, the walking district to some extent. So I get to the point where it seems to me that the macro level question that the Planning Commission is being asked to consider tonight is the public at large, are the new residents who will live in the 4,500 residential units and the public park system as a whole better off with the set of development agreements as proposed tonight, or better off without the set of development agreements as proposed before us tonight? If business terms much more favorable to the city form the basis for the agreements, I might feel different, but as proposed, I can't support them. As currently written, the development agreements obligate the city to award the CITYWALK master plan $36,718,133 and other valuable considerations upon execution of the agreements. In return, the city receives access to privately owned and maintained parks and public spaces that have not been defined regarding minimum expected facilities in them. We inherit the obligation to award credit, financial credit, to 5 neighborhood parks which don't meet the minimum acreage requirements for neighborhood parks as defined in our Parks and Recreation element of the general plan. And we receive a potentially, and I'm saying potentially, not certainly, but a potentially insufficient capped sum of funding covering construction costs, but not design costs, for 2 long-awaited city public parks to be built years from today. Additionally, the agreements don't define the rights and obligations of the parties regarding the parks and the public spaces. All the city has received in return for these commitments is an informal agreement to work the details of the facilities and amenities out at a later date. And again, that's not my idea of a contract. We give you the money now and we find out later on what we bought. Lastly, again, I find the inclusionary housing section in 6.3 to not be acceptable. In my view, the city has not received what it should receive in a contract that pledges 74% of its park fees that really should belong to the public park system. I think this will have a detrimental impact on our ability to fund the park's open space trails and recreation master plan. And as I previously stated, I think we've given a lot of value to Sunset beyond dollars. My overall conclusion is right now, based on this set of development agreements, I think the city is better off without the development agreements.
Okay, Mr. Howard Frank or Commissioner Alpert, you want to weigh in now? Who wants to go first?
Well, I guess I'll.
Okay, you're up.
I thought the mic was off when I cleared the throat. Okay, so I have to say that I had a lot of notes for the comment period. I will not retread that ground because I generally agree with the comments that have been made by Commissioner Kuznick and Commissioner Marks. You know, in looking at what our obligations are on this, when we have a development agreement in front of us, I looked at the zoning ordinance that covers it, D6-44, and we have 3 options: to recommend approval, modification, or rejection. I'm not in a position to reject, but nor am I in a position to recommend. I believe this is a modification situation for the reasons that have been talked about, but I'll also add to those reasons and first of all, let me acknowledge, I commend the parties here for negotiating this agreement. I know there's been a lot of back and forth and we don't see any of it. And I know there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. I don't attribute any bad faith. I think it's all good faith. However, what I'm thinking about is, 20 years down the road, when we don't have all these nice people here, and there are people sitting across the table that might not have the sunny dispositions and great intentions that you all have, there might be some disagreements here. And I would add to the list of issues that should be looked at these amenities, and including the parks that we're talking about, including the Annabelle Lake Community Center, are all tied to the phasing plan, which is Exhibit E to the 3 agreements. The phasing plan is governed in Section 5.3 of the 3 agreements, and it essentially, and I'll paraphrase this, in my reading, allows the developer pretty much unadulterated discretion on how to proceed forward with the plan. And I'm going to read a sentence that I find, maybe I'm not understanding it. It says, this is in packet page 27, section 5.3 on the timing of project construction. And again, this incorporates Exhibit E, which is the phasing plan, essentially. Middle of the first paragraph, any changes to the phasing plan will be discussed in advance with the planning director. I think that's a great start. And then nothing. There's no mechanism by which to resolve any issues between if, for example, and this is a hypothetical, the developer goes to the planning director 10 years from now and says, you know what, we want to bump everything out 5 years because the interest rates are higher than we thought they were going to be at this point. And by the way, that includes, returfing the field at Iron Horse, that includes Henry Ranch Park. And then the planning director says, well, I don't think you have grounds for that. What's the remedy? This doesn't even require it to come back to any committee or commission to revisit those issues. And so to me, when I talk to friends and family and people in the community about this plan, and I've been I voted for it. I'm a big defender of it. And I think the plan as we approved it is a great benefit for the city and I think for Bishop Branch. However, I always get questions about, well, when's all this going to happen? When are we going to start seeing these benefits? When are we going to have these nice parks? When is this city green going to be built? And I always talked in amorphous terms because I said, well, there's probably going to be some development agreements and we'll have some more certainty. And yes, Exhibit E does in fact have anticipated construction start dates, but Section 5.3 makes that completely aspirational and not legal in any regard. So I think that given the considerations the city is giving up, that I would hope for some more teeth in the phasing plan and some sort of mechanism by which future disagreements on the phasing plan can be addressed, other than it just has to be discussed with the planning director and then we don't know what happens after that. Along those same lines, the amenities in particular, for example, the 3 off-site park improvements that are being contemplated are triggered to certain building permits. For example, I think the negotiated number is 450 on Woodlot Park. And the phasing plan says that's when the construction starts, but nowhere in the phasing plan or anywhere in the document that I could find does it say when these amenities need to be completed. And again, I know there's no ill intent. I don't expect any of the current stakeholders to stick a shovel in the ground and throw a tractor out there and say, okay, we started, and then just let it go for 5 years. But under this agreement, as long as they start it, they would be in compliance with this agreement. So again, I'm asking for some sort of defined period. It can be something very reasonable that that the developer can live with, that sets when these things are actually going to be done. So those are my main comments in addition to what I've already heard. And let me just double check with my notes here. But so for me, this is an acknowledgement of a very difficult job. But if I'm grading it, I'm grading it as an incomplete, and would ask for some modifications and for revisiting the park credit in particular. I think that the cap amount on the amendment on the 3 offsite parks not being indexed to inflation is a problem, especially in light of the fact that it does not at this point include permitting and design fees. And so I would also, I think Commissioner Marks had the same concern on that issue. So with that, I will close my comments for now. Thank you.
Mr. Calverts.
Well, so fortunately or unfortunately, almost everything that I was thinking I might say has been said, but, you know, echoing those before me, you know, this is all about the development agreement, is not about CITYWALK. CITYWALK is a terrific project and was excited to see it approved. You know, we all approved it 5-0, and I was glad that the City Council upheld our decision to move forward. And this is strictly around the development agreement. And in anticipation of tonight, we were fortunate to have had the opportunity, or I was, to be able to, you know, study this for several weeks, because I was able to watch the Parks Commission, and they did see the draft of this 2 weeks ago. So I was able to watch that and was able to study it for a couple of weeks, although it was modified slightly. And then, never having seen a development agreement before, I recalled that Commissioner Kuznick and I at the League of California Cities attended a seminar on the Planning Commissioner's role in reviewing development agreements. And then 2 years ago at Sonoma State Planning Commission, I attended a seminar given by Ms. Patty Curtin on what you should look for in reviewing these kinds of documents. So I felt at least a little bit prepared on what I should be looking for in these things. And among everything else, a development agreement in my mind is a contract. You know, it's a business deal, you know, and as much as we want to get excited about parks and whether it's a good deal or a bad deal, I'm going to, you know, let Commissioner Marks and let the business people like Debbie and Joe and Jerry focus on that. I'm going to focus on what is our job as a planning commissioner on reviewing the deal, you know, and what do we need to do tonight? And Debbie, I want to thank you for putting up the slide and what do we need to do tonight? And I did pull up the zoning code, chapter 4, because we have to make findings, or the City Council has to make findings in order to approve this. And, you know, so I tried to think about that, you know, and is the agreement consistent with the general plan and any applicable specific plans? So Debbie, thank you for highlighting some of those sections, because it wasn't in the staff report and you gave some of them, and, you know, and I tried to think about whether it was or not, and I can actually conclude that it is consistent with some of the specific plans. And then you caught the second one, that is it consistent with the provisions of the zoning ordinance, the municipal code, and the state subdivision map act. So you caught the 15-year versus 25 years, so that was fixed. And, you know, I struggled with the state subdivision map act. There was no call out in the staff report or any place else that it is consistent with, but it does say so. We're supposed to make a finding that it's consistent with that. So before I would be able to sign off and say it's consistent with, I think I would need staff's help to make sure that it is. And I assume that it is, but the zoning code tells us that we're supposed to, before we say that we can send the development agreement on up forward to the City Council to say that we've done our job, I'd ask for some help there. You know, the agreement will not be detrimental to the health, safety, and general welfare, will not adversely affect the orderly development of property or the preservation of property values. So when I think about the development agreement, one of the things it does in the development agreement in general, it minimizes risk from the developer on, you know, future fees and uncertainty. And so from that standpoint, it sort of takes away some of the risk of the project actually getting built, you know. And so from that standpoint, it does minimize some risk that a project will get built. And so, with some of the comments that Commissioner Marks made about ensuring that it helps us meet our RENA numbers, and it says that the project does get built as we approved it, I think it is consistent with D645E3 and E4. So, I feel comfortable saying that we're doing our job as it relates to the zoning code. With that said, what's missing in the zoning code, but we did talk about it a lot tonight, does the development agreement provide sufficient benefit to the community to justify entering into the agreement? And that's compared to what I would consider the not doing a development agreement, So as everybody has said before me, it's really complicated. Is it a good financial decision? My gut says it's kind of hard to tell. It's a lot of cash flow stuff. And then if it was a real financial analysis, which I know the city's done, and I know darn well Sunset has, they've done spreadsheets all over the place and they know what the NPV is. We don't. I don't know if giving up $36 million in exchange for $8 million in construction in 10 years from now is the NPV is better or worse, and we don't see that. But I'm going to say that I trust that the negotiating table behind closed doors have concluded that this NPV is better than some other NPV. So I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to go where Commissioner Frank did. Is it a good contract? And my conclusion is I have a really hard time recommending to the city council that it's a good contract. And in my experience, a good contract, it's understandable, it's unambiguous, and it goes into enough detail so that what both parties agree to, both parties will leave knowing off that if there's ever a disagreement, people can pick up the document and both parties have clear understanding what was intended by the agreement. And I have to say that Exhibit E, which talks about the amenities and the phasing, is very lacking in my mind, because if anybody were to pick up the phasing plan, and Commissioner Marks went in tremendous detail explaining what he felt was missing, I would just say that if somebody were to pick this up and say, Iron Horse Trail Improvements X2, I don't know what that means. Actually, IHT Improvement X2, if I were to hand it to a judge and said, you resolve it, what that means, because Debbie's long gone, Jerry's long gone, what does that mean? The judge might not even be able to not even know what that acronym is. So I would suggest that I would feel comfortable sending this to City Council with my stamp of endorsement that the city and Sunset take some time and add the language that explains what that means. If that means adding 10 benches to the Iron Horse Trail between Crow Canyon and Bollinger Canyon, or 4 water fountains, or whatever it takes, that we take the time to do that. And that's what I think is truly missing to turn the agreement into what I would consider a good contract. And that's what I would feel is the most important thing that we could add to this, and again, I wasn't part of the negotiating team. I wasn't behind the closed doors on whether $36 million is the right deduct. I trust that Joe and Debbie, worked really hard to get the best financial deal that they felt they could. And, they went in wanting more, and then Sunset went in wanting more, and then out came the best deal they felt they could, and they could do that. So I'm not going to offer up new deals from the dais. I don't feel that's our job, and so I think with that said, I think those are my comments to not be redundant. My last comment was, Debbie, you sort of alluded to that, you've started to, study the comments from Greenfire Law, and you'll finish that off, but if there's anything that, merits our feedback or response, you'll let us know. But, obviously it's too soon for us to have any meaningful discussion on that, coming as late as it did today. So I think that concludes my comments for tonight.
Does any of the commissioners want to say anything before I speak? Okay. Even us simple country lawyers can count to 5. And I'm pretty good at counting votes. Let me make a few comments. First of all, I wish I had seen Commissioner Kuznick's math before we came in here, because I'm a little slow on my math, and I think I know where she was going. And I know Commissioner Marks sort of had the same concept. My comment on the park dedication amount is, I think that you are leaving off the maintenance costs of the park. If Sunset had billed them and turned them over to the park as city property, the city would be required to maintain the parks. The number that was floated was about $500,000 a year. And if you're looking at 25 years, you're talking about $12.5 million without discounting to present value. I think that looking at the park deal without factoring in the maintenance costs that are being borne by Sunset, I think is erroneous. Second, about the parks themselves, I mean, I made a comment when this whole proposal came to us, is that the parks that are being proposed, with the exception of City Green, are really an amenity for the residents of the towers, that I never saw them as being a prime source of usage by other people from the city. It's in an infill area. I think that you need to be a little bit more flexible with infill parks than you would a park in Doherty Valley. You cannot compare the neighborhood parks in Doherty Valley with what you have in CITYWALK, simply because of the size and the location of those parks. That being said, I had a question for staff, and this is jointly addressed to Debbie or to Alicia, whoever wants to take the first crack. Hypothetically, let's assume that Sunset says, you know, based on the comments tonight, we're withdrawing our request for a development fee. Under the conditions of approval for CITYWALK, is Sunset required to build, maintain, and open up for public access all of the park area that we've been talking about?
No, their only obligation would be 49.3 million in park fees paid over the life of the project, and that fee would be locked into place now, and they could basically gate the parks and make them own private parks for their own residents.
Okay. So they're basically, they could go back and say, we are going to pay $49 million, but we are going to pay it pursuant to your fee schedule, which means as it is built out, the impact fees are paid. It's not that we write a check for $49 million tomorrow. You're spreading $49 million over 25 years. And I would guess the discounted value of that sum is considerably less than $49 million.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm not an economist. I can't give you the net present value of that amount, but I'm pretty sure it's under $49 million, no matter how you count it. Another question for Ms. Chamberlain and Ms. Poon. Let's suppose that we take a vote and we decline to approve the resolution. We vote against it. Does the developer have the right to take the present development agreement up to the city council, notwithstanding our disapproval?
It's well, Alicia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it automatically goes to the city council because it's a recommendation and it's a legislative decision. So the council would take action on it.
Okay, so in other words, if we vote against the resolution, it doesn't die here. It just goes up with a recommendation not to approve.
Is that correct, Lee?
Yeah, with your comments, it would, you know, if you said it was inconsistent with the general plan and so forth, yes, you would take all those comments, and it would just, the staff could present it to the city council for consideration.
Okay, next question. Commissioner Marks made some comments about the inclusionary housing part of the development agreement, which I tried to read the housing portions of our municipal code. This is a rental property. So does the developer have the option under the inclusionary ordinance for rental apartments to skip on building affordable units and just pay a fee?
law requires that any city's inclusion ordinance have an alternative compliance method or ability to do that. In the case of CITYWALK, as I stated in the presentation, as Sons has agreed to, they've committed to building all the units within CITYWALK and not paying a fee. If they were to propose a fee payout, that is at the discretion of the city to agree to or not agree to.
Okay.
So while they would propose alternative compliance, we do not have to accept it.
Okay. All right,
Eric,
so-
can I follow up with a question there before I forget?
Sure.
Debbie, if that's the case, why do we have section 6.3 in there?
You refresh my memory on this section. Well, I think we don't, Sons has made a commitment, but we have a 27-year build out too. So there may be better ideas that come up that may allow for maybe an all affordable housing project to be built in CITYWALK. So all the units would be in one building. And so there's some different, typically we look to have the units spread out throughout the development, but we may get other opportunities in the future. We don't want to preclude ourselves that there may be a great idea or something that the city really wants to embrace, and we can't do that. Like I mentioned, that alternative compliance goes before the city for ultimate decision. So Sunset can propose and we can still say no. So there's really no harm, no foul. It's just a safety valve that if need be, the city can agree to something in the future that if we deem it appropriate.
But that could be done by a mutually agreed upon amendment to the agreement if the section wasn't included in there.
Well, the section is included by reference to the zoning ordinance because it is in our zoning ordinance. So you can't legislate out our zoning ordinance.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Mr. Marks?
I understand Debbie's answer. Maybe later on I'll have a comment.
Okay, I just want to make sure you got your question answered. I didn't
Yes,
ask you
thank
agreed
you.
with it. So okay, all right. Okay, so it's quite clear to me, and I'm not going to spend anybody's time discussing it, but it's quite clear to me from listening to the comments of the commissioners that this resolution is not ready for prime time. There's several commissioners who don't want to do an up or down vote tonight. I think that their preference, maybe that's too strong, too weak a word, would be to do some revisions to the development agreement. So the first question I have is procedurally, we have in front of us a development agreement that's up for approval or disapproval as the case may be. Do we have the option of continuing this subject matter to a later date?
We certainly can continue to another meeting to October 20th would be my preference. But I think some of the comments that have been raised by the commission, I believe that Sunset would like to provide some clarification, some responses to those also. If that's appropriate, Chair.
Oh yeah, I'm going to give them a chance to do that. But the reason I asked my question is I want the commissioners to know what their options are after Sunset and the staff, because I think staff needs to be set on this point. I want them to know what potential options are after Sunset and staff has responded to the comments of the commissioners, because this is not a decision that I think needs to be taken or can be taken lightly. As someone did point out, the package we got on Friday was over 700 pages. That's a lot of material to cover. And it's obvious that several of our commissioners have spent a lot of time going over this development agreement in fine detail. And I think that they have raised questions that deserve to be answered one way or another before a final decision is made. So that being said, I'm going to allow the applicant first and then staff second to do cleanup to respond to some of the commissioners' comments if they so choose.
Chair,
So,
well,
yes?
sorry, through the chair, one clarifying point. The zoning ordinance says in D6-44B that you have to transmit a recommendation to the council within 30 days. So
30
once you
days
have
of what? 30 days of what?
30 days following your date of action. So whenever you guys take a date of whenever you take some action or recommendation, then you have to make sure it goes to the council within 30 days. So I just want to make sure you know.
Well, does continuing the hearing count as an action or not?
I don't think it's considered an action unless you do the approval or some disapproval or recommend.
disapproval.
Right, recommend
we take a
with
final vote.
modification.
Right,
Right.
if we make a final decision, I think the 30-day rule applies.
Yeah.
But if we are just continuing the hearing and at this point not making a final decision, then that would not apply, would it?
Correct. I think that
Right.
wouldn't apply until
Yeah,
then.
one of the things I'm trying to make sure is we have a fair outline of what our options are and what the time constraints are, given the various options. So let me go back to Mr. Engen and Ms. Curtin. Do you have some comments you would like to make at this point?
Yes, I would, please.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. I want to summarize a couple of points that I think where we have a disagreement in philosophy. It seems that, when we went through this plan, we obviously, as you know, we're not obligated to build parks. Our project could be approved without parks because by your zoning code, we're not required to build parks. So it could not be forced upon us. And we negotiated, we did this project in good faith. And then, and we were also asked to make sure that these were all open to the public and make them accessible to the public. And we go in good faith and we design a great plan and we do all these parks and we make them open to the public. And after the fact, we come back and say, oh yeah, but by the way, we're not going to give you any credit for them. It seems a little unfair to us that all of a sudden, because we've already owned the land, you don't get credit. Well, you've owned your house for how many years, but when you sell it, you're only going to get partial credit. That's not really fair. We're taking that land that we could do development on. We could do we could have asked for more density and been within the zone and been within our right. But we designed a fair plan, and then we're getting zero credit for the land that we're giving up in perpetuity that we could be building other buildings on that we're opening to the public and getting zero value for it. And only looking at the construction costs. Well, that's highly unfair in our view that on that approach. We think the land is value. We've given up that land in perpetuity. We're going to invest money in land, regardless of how long we've owned it. We've only owned the BR 2600 building, by the way, for around 6 years or so. That lake was never open to the public. Most of the people didn't even know a lake existed until we purchased the building and the mayor's made some improvements and opened it to the public. And beyond just doing that, we're making significant investments to make that lake accessible, to add boats, to make it a very active lake park that's would be a wonderful amenity that any city would die to have in their community. So I think we come at it from a very different, philosophical view in that the city's taken, well, you're going to build it, you need it anyway, you're getting value and you shouldn't get any credit for that land because you've owned it. And I just really have a difficult time digesting that point of view that we shouldn't get any value just because we've owned the land. So that's a big kind of I think a disconnect in our philosophy in viewing this. I think that the land does have value, and sure, the changing the zoning added value to the land, and sure, adding units adds value to the land. However, it's also adding value to the city. It's allowing that by doing that zoning, it's allowing us to build the units that you so desire to have in your core to protect the outsides of the city. It's what you want to do to fill your arena need. It's what you want to do to create a vibrant downtown city. And so because we're obligated, we're doing this, we're being penalized for being a partner to the city and bringing this development, to fruition. So I think I'd like to have, maybe a rethought around that position of not being able to get land value for valuable asset that we're providing. I think a couple of points on that Commissioner Marks brought up. I think I wanted to be clear. We have committed to build all 675 units in the master plan. That's been clear. Debbie made it clear. It wasn't as clear in the documents as it could be. We're going to make it clear in the documents. And so you're not losing any of those units, and we're not feeing out of those units. We're going to build those units. And I believe in the condition of approval, it actually said we were supposed to enter into an inclusionary housing agreement as part of the condition of approval. And that's why it's in there. And I think, as Debbie articulated and is accurate, is that it's not that we're trying to not pay or not build, but as of today, the current philosophy is, well, the city would prefer that you build them kind of equally throughout the development. It's harder to finance that way. It's harder to make work financially, but we've agreed to do that. But in the future, that vision may change. And there may be some great concept, as Debbie mentioned, where you can build an all affordable and you can finance it. That might actually accelerate getting the development of those affordable units to the city faster. And so I think it's a tool. And again, the city doesn't have to agree to it, but I think it's a tool to provide in there that allows us to have the flexibility in the future to accommodate something like that, that we can potentially accelerate getting those affordable units to market. And around the design of the parks, of course, we've been here for 40 years. I think you've seen the quality of what we've done. We didn't make it vague on purpose to get out from creating quality parks. And I don't believe, Commissioner Marks, that we ever, if it was said, it wasn't meant that way, and that these parks were only going to be grassy knolls. Of course, we're going to create amenities, because it's not only for the benefit of the residents that will live in that community, but for the residents that will visit it. And so these parks will be far more than grassy knolls. And, you know, if we want to add a few comments in there about some of the amenities that need to be addressed, that's fine. But any park, any kind of document you did 25 years ago that laid out what you thought park vision should be, probably isn't the same vision you have today. And so we've committed to work with the city to come up with those designs. You've got the city, the Parks Commission has great ideas. They know what the community wants. Those visions and ideas are going to change over time. And so we tried to make it flexible so that we could create great parks going forward. It benefits us, it benefits the city, it benefits the residents. I think as it relates to Commissioner Frank's comments around the phasing plan, remember that while we're getting these entitlements, I mean, if it's not affordable or not financially feasible, we won't build it. I mean, nobody would. You wouldn't if you were going to develop this with your own money. And so the phasing plan is, and the ability for flexibility is, if the economy goes into the tank and the interest rates go to 15%, and if we built it, we would lose money or we couldn't lease it, that doesn't make sense to say, oh, well, you're under contract, obligated to build it, whether you lose money or not. That just doesn't make sense. So the idea of that is to allow that flexibility. And also we may decide, because the market's telling us, the demand's telling us, that we may want to build on 2600 before we build on 1A, or we might want to build 3A before BR1A. And so it's providing a vehicle that allows us to be flexible to complete with, to work with the market conditions and work with the demand. And so it would be difficult and almost impossible to put down a phasing schedule and say, you must build by that schedule no matter what. That doesn't work in the commercial sense. So we feel that flexibility is really important. I think it was also mentioned about a number of pages, which is true. There were a lot of pages, but I think if you look through that, there were a significant number of those pages that were already reviewed by the city in the Planning Commission when the project was approved. There was a lot of stuff in there around the previously approved items, the mitigation monitoring report, all of those things. So there were a number of documents that had already been reviewed as part of this project. And so, you know, sure, we're willing to work on some things and clarify some things, but we have a very strong, you know, view as it relates to what credit are worth and what the land is worth. And I don't think that we should be penalized for designing a great project in concert with the city to be told after the fact that you're not going to get credit for any of that. just, you're going to build it all and you're going to pay these fees. So I'd like to have some discussion around that and have you take a revisit around that. I'll make sure I've caught all of the main elements that we wanted to address. As it relates to, it was a good comment that Commissioner Franks made about, well, you mentioned when you can build the parks, and there was no ill intention that you're not going to just complete them, but there's no definition on completion. We could obviously put in there that once they commence construction, we can complete them within 6 months or a year, whatever the required term would be based on the park, the difficulty of the park. We can put end dates on that so that it wouldn't be open in time. We have no issue around that. So I think that's an easy one to solve. And again, when, we talked about why we capped the park, the offside park fees, who came up with those numbers, those were numbers given to us from the city. We did not develop those numbers. It's difficult though, and around if the Parks Commission, who are the professionals at this, haven't been able to design or even think about how they want to program those parks, I'm not quite sure how we would put that into an agreement and define something that they haven't yet defined, and they're the ones that would be defining it. It wouldn't be us. So while I understand the desire, and I'm not opposed to putting some parameters around the kinds of amenities that should be thought of or that should be included, I think we need to have flexibility in there, because those amenities may change. What's amenity today may not be what's desired as an amenity tomorrow. And so I think while we can do some of that, I think we need to be careful about, locking in that and allow some flexibility for that to change. I think I covered the really major issues around the comments that I heard tonight. So if you have any more questions of me, I'd be happy to answer them, but I would seriously like to have you reconsider your thoughts around the view and the worldview of these park credits, because the city will be getting a lot of value in this land and these parks in perpetuity, and as opposed to getting the fee over time, us building less parks, having less quality of a project. So I think that's what I have tonight. Thank you.
Do any of the commissioners want to ask some questions of Mr. Engen, since he's here and is on a roll?
Right.
I'd like to respond to a couple of things.
Well, why don't we hold off on our response?
Okay.
We're going to have another go around among ourselves. I just want to know if you want to pick his brain some more.
No.
Okay. Ms. Curtin, I should offer the opportunity to you to speak too.
Thank you. I just have a few brief comments. I echo Jerry's comments, but I just wanted to clarify on the phasing plan. The phasing plan is connected to the number of building or the unit that's being built. So the phasing plan could only change when the building permits are issued or when they're going to be pulled. However, the amenities are still going to be connected to that number of building permits. So the amenities would not change in their timing, only the timing of the actual building of the units. So I wanted to make that clarification. Two, I thought it was an excellent point brought up by the chair that what was not specifically identified in the development agreement is the fact that Sunset monetarily, that Sunset is agreeing and their affiliates is agreeing to maintain the parks for the 25-year period, which is in fact about a $12.5 million maintenance cost. So that's extremely important to consider in the calculations. And then three, I wasn't quite sure if Commissioner Albert was asking that the general plan and zoning consistency findings be made in the development agreement itself. They were made in the resolutions that are attached to it, and we could certainly make specific reference to that.
Okay. Now,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Unless Mr. Engen has some additional comments, I'd like to ask Director Chamberlain to offer some of her thoughts.
Well, I don't, Jerry and Patty did a great job of summarizing, but what I want to remind the commission is, there are going to be subsequent entitlements that go before the commission where those park components will be vetted by the Parks Commission and designed in detail. That's what we've been talking about. It's a master plan. We don't have all the details for the parks because we don't know what they are. Woodlot was designed many, many, many years ago, and that park plan is probably not coming to fruition. So as Jerry mentioned, parks haven't been designed, but then they've been redesigned because time has passed. And so just, be mindful of that. There is another opportunity to look at these park designs as those parks come in with each phase of the future development. So we're not signing off today, not knowing what we're getting. That's part of the planning process, and we can condition the parks as to what we want them to be. The walking district, we are going to be re-executing our contract with Design Workshop to begin the city designed walking district, which will identify all the amenities that will be in the walking district, which Sunset will be required to construct as part of the parkways. So we've tied, and really the walking district, well, it was born very early, many years ago, but the opportunity that Sunset has provided the city to have that walking district constructed by Sunset and not at city costs is a huge benefit to the city. Will get done sooner than later. And just on the urban park side, as I mentioned with the Parks Department, Parks Commission, and as we've talked about, San Ramon has always constructed suburban parks. That's been the nature of San Ramon. However, we are changing the face of San Ramon to a more urbane, I'd like to say, because not urban, we're not San Francisco, but we're more urbane. We're kind of this cross between suburban and urban. And so we have to acknowledge that this is a different community. It's going to look different than Doherty Valley or South San Ramon. But as the parks in Doherty Valley and South San Ramon, as a young mom, I could take my kids to any park in the city. It didn't matter. It was a neighborhood park, was open to the public. So if I want to bring my family to CITYWALK, I certainly can do that. They're open to the public. As CITYWALK residents can go to the other parks. But if live down the street from a park, yes, I lived next to Boone Acres for many years. I would go to that park all the time because I could walk. It was 100 yards from my house. So, that's the idea. There are parks that will directly serve those residents, but those residents can also go to any park in San Ramon. CITYWALK folks can go to Doherty Valley Parks if they decide, to Bellingham Square Park, which is surrounded by residential units, or Fire Truck Park, or Six Pillars Park. So we just, the face of San Ramon is changing with the approval of the CITYWALK project. It's taking us to a different design. The core is the core of the city. It's meant to have higher density. And with higher density goes a different type of park design. So that's just really something to kind of keep in mind as we move through this. And I also like to mention that the Free Preserve project, as we all know, has been through many iterations, and as mentioned, the phasing of construction really is tied to economics and the marketplace. Right now we're in a recessionary time. And so as we see hopefully we'll see a strong economic upswing here and construction will boom, but we could be hit with the recession of 2009 where construction basically stopped. We saw that with the Free Preserve project where they then had to come back and completely redesign their project for, besides economics and some other issues too, but we saw a significant downturn in construction in the recession. So the goal for CITYWALK, is the applicant has indicated, and we've all discussed, is 25 to 27 years. But it could be much sooner. All these amenities could come on much sooner, depending on how the economy goes. And just one more comment on the maintenance costs, as Ms. Curtin alluded, it's not for 25 years, it's for the lifetime of the project.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind. $500,000 or so in today's dollars over perpetuity is a central benefit that the city's not having to maintain those acres of parks. And then the other point, is, and Commissioner Marks mentioned this, City Hall behind all of you tonight was built substantially less by Sunset doing the construction. They can construct cheaper. And so the $8.8 million is the total cap, but understand they can construct those parks less expensive than the city can, is really one of the things really to focus on. And then reiterating, it's not a $36 million fee payment to Sunset. It's a value that we're giving the parks that they're going to be building and maintaining for the city. They're not being given cash directly. They will be paying us cash in the form of constructing those parks and the fee payment.
Yeah, sure, Gary.
So hopefully these are really simple questions, just to check off a couple of boxes. We did get a question on the police substation that's part of the Bishop Ranch 3A. Could you explain where is that anticipated being located? Just to check the box so we can answer that question. It was asked, where will that be in the 200 square feet? Maybe that's a question for you, Jerry or Debbie. Is that where were you planning to physically install that or locate that?
Well, we don't know yet because it's the phase 3 is not planned yet, but it'll be somewhere in one of the retail store outlets, probably maybe facing Bollinger. But that's a great example, Commissioner Alpert, that component of the development agreement will be programmed when that phase for BR3A comes in. And there's a timing of, I think, 1,700 units when it has to be constructed. So we all can understand that that portion of BR3A will be constructed by the time that trigger of 1,700 units is required.
Okay, but in one of the new buildings that'll be built as part of the 3A complex. Great, thank you. And then in Exhibit E, on the phasing, we show Annabelle Lake access enhancements and amphitheater down around the end. Should we take from that the current thinking is that they will be done kind of right around where they're showing up on the column around 2046, 2049? Is that the current thinking? Of course, it can change, but that's the current thinking on when either the work will be done, or in the case of the amphitheater, the work will be done, or the decision will be made then or sooner that it'll be removed from the project, just based on where it's showing up on the column.
It could be sooner, but yes.
Sure. That's the best guess on where we might want to do it. Okay, that's helpful. And then I think those are the two easy questions as people are getting their thoughts ready to talk about harder stuff. Thanks.
Does anybody have any other questions for Ms. Chamberlain? I know some people have comments, but do the comments in a minute.
Sure, Wallace, I have a quick question. So in this issue of the maintenance, and again, I would say that the first time I saw numbers associated with maintenance costs was this evening in your PowerPoint. So that's a lot to digest. It's more to digest. But yes, Sunset has agreed to take that on. But if they had not agreed to it, the city has mechanisms by which, maintenance fees are passed on to residents, and such as a community benefit district, much like we get landscape and lighting districts. So yes, Sunset has agreed to this obligation, but there would have been a mechanism by which they would have been charged for it if they hadn't agreed to it, is my understanding of a community benefit fund. Is that correct?
Well, we do have that mechanism that we could use, but also, Sunset agreeing to do the maintenance cost. The amenities from what Jerry has described, and he can, may be different than what may be a higher cost to the city to maintain though than what they can maintain them for. And so it may not be a full one-to-one exchange. And so it's just different ways to approach it, basically. Does the city want to have to hire additional personnel and pay the benefit cost over time to maintain the parks, where, the general plan and the parks master plan really look at that public-private partnership. And this is one opportunity that that as we discussed in the development agreement, is a good opportunity for that public-private partnership where the city isn't provided with the maintenance costs ongoing, where we could have a recessionary time and we go to level service C or B like we did in the past. And so is that something we want to do for our parks, or where we have someone who's going to maintain those even through those recessionary times at the level that they expect them to be maintained at? And the city does too.
Right. I just wanted to clarify that, it's not just one without an other.
Right.
on that particular topic, even though we didn't really spend a lot of time discussing it. Thank you.
Any other questions of staff right now? Okay, if there are none, here's what I would like to do. First, it seems to me that we don't have, I don't think we want to do an up or down vote tonight. I think that most of the people want to move ahead with a development agreement that's acceptable. I don't think anyone wants to throw the agreement out as is right now. That would require us, not us, but the city, because we're in a little different position than we normally are. So when we have an application come in front of us, we're the ones who direct the conditions of approval. We tell developers, in order to do this project, you have to do A, B, and C. But this is a development agreement between the city and the developer. We don't get to tell the city what to do. The most we can offer is some suggestions about how we think the agreement should be, in this case, redrafted to make it more palatable to the city. It seems to me there's basically three areas where you have all expressed concerns one way or the other. The first and most obvious is the park credit question. There's no one who's opposed to the parks. I don't think there's anyone's opposed to having a park owned by Sunset and maintained by Sunset. The sole question seems to be, given that there is a potential $49 million park impact fee at issue, the extent to which, the dollar extent to which Sunset can get a credit for that through the development agreement. That is clearly, to me, the most important issue that we have talked about, certainly the one we talked about at most tonight. The second issue has to do with some of the terms of the development agreement itself. A number of you have indicated that in your view, certain provisions in the agreement are too vague or ambiguous. I know Commissioner Alpert did that. I know that Commissioner Frank talked about questions about the enforceability of certain provisions, the timing, the time frame for certain provisions. That's something that several of you mentioned on a specific number of terms. The third one, and I think that probably Commissioner Marks is the one who spent the most time on this particular subject, was terms that may not be vague and ambiguous, but he thought they were overly favorable to the developer. In that case, needed to be revised to make it fairer, at least to the city. Those seem to be the three main concerns of the commission. Now, if we don't vote up or down tonight, then what we are basically asking staff to do is to go back and talk to Sunset about some of the terms and obviously the credit that's being offered by the city on the park impact fee. I read Mr. Engen as being willing to talk to the city along those lines. He started out by talking about a philosophical difference. I honestly don't think it's a philosophical difference in terms of whether a credit should be granted. I think the question really is to quantify the credit that is fair to both the developer and the city. As we pointed out tonight, one that I think it was actually mentioned in the staff report that had to do with the maintenance costs. But I don't think that really got wound up in the discussion that we've had tonight. So here's what I would like to do. As always, it generally is a vote of the Planning Commission, but my suggestion tonight is this. I think that we ought to go around the table, figuratively speaking, and basically put out the areas that you would like staff to talk to Sunset about. Now, it takes two sides to tango. No one can force Sunset to come to the table and talk, but at this juncture, it appears to me that that is desire of both parties. And to reach an agreement that, as we say in the settlement biz, no one is really happy with, but they can live with. So what I'd like you to do, assuming I'm right, that you're not ready to vote up or down, is to outline for staff and also for the benefit of Sunset, the areas that you would like to see addressed in the development agreement that you feel would make it fairer certainly for the city and perhaps all parties concerned. So I hope that's not too winded, that's not too vague and ambiguous. but it's to really basically summarize so that the city staff has an opportunity to address the concerns that you've raised with Sunset. And hopefully they can come back to us and said, okay, we've sat down and we've modified these provisions along these lines. Is that acceptable to you? It seems to me that should be the goal that we're all working towards. So that being said, I'm opening up the floor to comments by the commissioners. Commissioner
Mr.
Morris.
Chairman, I'd like to make some comments. My first comments are to really to Debbie and the staff, and particularly the city attorney. If Sunset had been proposing the 5 parks as only available to their residents and was going to pay the $49 million, I would have no comment at all. I would say, fine. What I don't see is authorization in the general plan to accept these as neighborhood parks that are in lieu of other neighborhood parks that we're used to seeing. I understand that the world is changing. I've been a planner for close to 50 years. I know that we are urbanizing. And I know that these buildings actually, if you want to know the historical context, are what Ebenezer Howard produced in England in the 1800s. If you want to get into planning, my point is, you can't say we are going to accept these because the times are changing. We always have to find general plan consistency, general plan compliance. And my question is, because I don't see it, how do you say that a 0.6 acre park that is 1.4 acres short of the 2 acre standard complies with the Parks and Recreation element? How do you say that any of these parks meets that standard and therefore is compliant with the general plan? And again, it's not enough to be compliant with the land use element. It's important to be compliant with it, but you have to be compliant with every element. And so I would ask Patricia, can you find a way that we can say that a 0.6 acre or a 0.5 acre or 1.5 acre park is compliant with the standard called out very specifically in the general plan? I'll go on because I don't want to put you on the spot. If we're going to come back at some later date, I'd like an answer to that. To me, you don't just void making the general plan finding real just to pass a project. You amend the general plan if you have to. And I know that's an arduous process, but it should have been started a long time ago when we saw these parks, if that's where the credit was going to go. Next, I would say to Jerry, I didn't say I wasn't going to give you any credit. I wouldn't offer any credit. I said that I thought City Green was compliant and should get credit, but I don't know what's going to go in it. I said that the walking district, I think it's like 10 acres or thereabouts, I'm prepared to offer credit for that. For Annabelle Lake, I don't know what we're talking about in terms of boats or times or anything like that. I'm asking for some information about it, but I didn't say I wouldn't offer credit. So I don't like being put in a box like that, where it's an all or nothing kind of situation. What I'm asking you to do is define what are the amenities. And you can certainly, and attorneys do this all the time. They write a section of a contract or a development agreement, and they provide flexible language for change. The agreement calls out, if we agree we need to change or if circumstances change, here's the process that we'll follow to do it. And here's who'll make the decision. But to tell me we're not going to deal with it because we need to have flexibility, there's a difference between flexibility and license. And I don't know, I think you would do the right thing. I think Alex Mayron Jr. would do the right thing. But 10 years from now, I don't know who's going to be there. I don't know who's going to be on the city council. And I don't know who's going to be on the planning commission or sitting where Debbie and Lauren sit. The reason you enter a contract is to get some specificity. I don't want to design these things right now, but let me give you an example. On the walking district. In my view, it's perfectly possible and would be desirable to say that at the intersection of Camino Ramon and the entrance to the BR 2600, there will be a large public plaza to be defined in detail at a later date. Right there, I know there's a plaza coming and I know where it is. I would say 2 smaller plazas, one at Bishop Drive and one at Executive Parkway that mimic the larger one. Again, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I know that I'm getting something in the future. If in the future that turns out to not be a good thing, the section that includes that could call out the language and the process for changing it. So I think there's a difference between saying we'll get to it later and writing an agreement that gives both parties some level of certainty about what they're going to get. I think in terms of, the maintenance. Yes, Debbie went over it in her presentation, but I think it's a little unfair to charge the commission with not considering something that they haven't seen before. Had that been included in the staff report and in the development agreement, given that we had 4 days to read 727 pages, we probably would have seen it and known something about it. I think there's value there. I think there's value that we should consider. But to spring it on me at the same night and then wonder why I didn't consider it seems to me a little unfair. I've spent, and I'm assuming every one of my commissioners has done the same. I've spent hour upon hour on this project because I think it's a good project. And I'm trying to be fair on the development agreement. But we also have a responsibility to other parks in the city. And I think that it would be helpful if the staff might show us, how do they get funded? Where do we go to fund? If the opportunity arises to actually improve the Iron Horse Trail, where's the money going to come from? If the opportunity arises to retrofit some of the older parks with some of the more modern facilities that are found in the newer parks, where's that going to go? Well, how are we going to fund that? So right now we have to balance money being left over for the general overall public park system, as well as trying to be fair to the Bishop Ranch. But I want to end by saying that there's no one on this commission that wants to stick it to the Bishop Ranch or Sunset Development. We just simply have a difficult situation, a short time to read the information, and one meeting to make a decision unless tonight we vote to extend it. It doesn't seem to me from a process standpoint, the commission was treated the way it should be.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Marks. Who wants to go next? Commissioner Kuznick, I'm going to pick on you anyway. You're muted. You're muted.
There you go. Thank you. And I won't belabor the significant points that I made because as I started my comments, I spent a lot of time working on those. But I just want to, again, focus back on the idea of if I am the average San Ramon citizen, and what I'm hearing from the Planning Commission is a credit to a very large development of $35 million, I darn well ought to be able to explain it in a way and that everybody can get behind this. And I haven't been convinced about that tonight. And that is a significant impediment for me. I pulled out my handy dandy calculator and took the 35 million and some change and divided it by the 9,495 people, the 2.1 times 4,500 units. And it works out to that those folks, because they're largely the ones who are mostly going to benefit, are getting a benefit of almost 4,000 per person. Well, I don't know if that's a good fit for the other 82,000 who are citizens of our town. So again, I'm just going to go back to my basic point. You can disagree with how I got to the numbers. We can disagree on the value. Should we calculate the value? I can acknowledge that parks will be created. I also am still firm in my belief that when we approved the plans, that those were part of the plan. So I kind of think you're obligated. But again, you're going to have to convince me that the 35 million is a benefit that everybody can understand. And at this point, I'm not there yet. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Thank you. I'm going to pick Commissioner Frank to go next.
Okay, well, I'm not going to belabor everything I said. Jerry, I appreciate your comments on the timing of the phasing. I certainly understand the dilemma that a developer has. Regarding the language that's in that section, maybe I didn't convey it correctly. I wasn't looking for something ironclad that holds your feet to the fire in the future. I'm just looking for something with something of more substance regarding, if there's going to be any decisions made regarding phasing, that there's some further explanation about how that is going to happen, the transparency of it, as more than just a sentence saying that it's going to be discussed in advance with the planning director. I know that Ms. Curtin and our city attorney's office are much smarter at this than I am, and I'm sure that there can be some language that can be fashioned that will alleviate some anxiety that not only I might have on that, but the citizens of the city. So I didn't mean to convey that you should be held to some ironclad phasing schedule. I think Ms. Curtin mentioned that, and I appreciate your comments, that the amenities, in particular these offsite parks, are tied to unit numbers as opposed to locations. And to the extent that that can be clarified in either the phasing plan or somewhere in the agreement, that would be great. In other words, Woodlot Park, I guess the negotiated trigger point is unit 450 on that, I think. And that would be tied to unit 450, whether that unit comes in BR 2600 or 3A or whatever. I think that was the intent of the agreement. And if it says that would be helpful. And I think Jerry had also mentioned that there was no problem setting sort of an expected completion date, whatever that reasonably, everybody comes to, I'm sure will be fine. It will help in dictating or meeting the expectations of our citizens as to when to expect these things to come online. Again, I wasn't attributing, I didn't think that these current actors would just stick a shovel on the ground and say, well, we started, it's good. I'm just worried about what happens in the future. So with that, I think I will turn it over to, by process of elimination, it's either going to be our eminent chair or it will be our former chair, Commissioner Alpert.
Well, I'm going to ladder it off to Commissioner Alpert.
Okie dokie. So again, I will not focus on the dollar amount negotiated. I'm going to go on faith that staff and Sunset negotiated hard and came out of the closed doors with the best dollar amount that both can live with, but would focus mostly on tightening up the language so that the contract is one that both parties can live with. And I know that Sunset knows well what that looks like. So, and I think Commissioner or Chair Wallace, you asked for some examples. So turning to Exhibit I, shall construct 40.35 acres of privately owned and maintained and publicly accessible parks. I would ask that the term publicly accessible have some definition. You know, when I met with Kathy Hyman of our Parks Department and I asked her what publicly accessible meant, she said, well, I assume that means like any other city park, open from, you know, dawn to dusk, you know, but, you know, as we all like to, you know, we all assume that's what that means, but, you know, if it's not, you know, and what I learned a long time ago, if it's not in the contract, it's not part of the deal, you know? So, you know, I think it's real simple to clean that kind of stuff up, you know, and I know that Sunset knows they would never sign a contract that they didn't know what they were signing up for. So I would look at things like the park fees on Exhibit I, and then, you know, especially the Exhibit E, you know, where it talks about what these things are included. Commissioner Marks gave examples, what's included in the 2.35 acres city green. I do appreciate that city staff will have some opportunity to participate in the design, but, you know, to you know, just expand on some of the language. I do appreciate the public parks construction and the, you know, the timing and the moving up of the dates, so that's helpful. The public amenities and the timing of those, I get that. The privately owned amenities, I think, you know, the call out that the maintenance is all included in the language that's there. So I think that's what I would want to focus on in the development agreement, just to make sure that, you know, when we review it at the next opportunity, that, you know, we can say that, you know, when Jerry's not here and Debbie's not here and Lauren's not here, that anybody can pick it up if things ever go south in the relationship, that the mean old judge that reads it in the future can say, yeah, we know what you guys really meant, so that it would be, you know, we all get what we sign up for today, you know. So that's where I would want to focus our energy on this, not, you know, and that's what I think, you know, would be where energy best spent, knowing full well that you guys negotiated hard and, you know, you'll continue to do that as best you can. So that's my comments.
Okay. The problem that we have on a development agreement is that it, by definition, extends over a long period of time. I know Commissioner Marks has negotiated many of them over his years as a planner. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we are looking at an agreement to cover 25 years on a number of phases of a project with 4,500 units and potentially 9,000 to 10,000 people living in it. I think one thing to keep in mind is this: the decision and the risk involved in building out any part of those phases of the project is solely with the developer. If the developer makes a wrong decision, they're the ones that are going to bear the economic impact, not really the city, although no one likes to have a half-completed building in their city. But it's, if you build it and no one comes, the developer is the one that's going to bear the risk of not being able to cover the mortgage. So I think by definition, there has to be some flexibility in how the phases get built. And I don't know if it was clear, but the way the development agreement is drafted, it allows the developer to build one phase before the other. BR 2600 before BR 1A, BR 3A before BR 1A. I mean, those are decisions that have to be made based on market conditions. So I don't think giving the developer flexibility to do that is unreasonable. We come back to the issue of the parks, and I'm getting the issue really boils down to what is the credit that is appropriate given the parks. And I would ask Ms. Curtin to follow up on Commissioner Marks's request that was fairly direct and simple, and that is, what justification can you find in our general plan that would allow us to approve parks that are below 2 acres when our standard or goal, depending on your point of view, is 2 acres? The second part would be, let's assume there isn't any clear, unambiguous justification for that in the general plan. Is there nonetheless a workaround because we're dealing with an urban situation and you just don't have the land down in Bishop Ranch really to do that? So there's a question of what we can and can't do. And as the attorney for the developer, I'd like you to give us your best shot on convincing us that your point of view is correct. With respect to some of the terms and conditions of the agreement, my question to staff and also to Mr. Engen is this. Do you have a sense of the sections of the development agreement? And really we're using the first one as a template. I think that's the one that most of us went through because the rest are similar. Do you have a good enough sense about what some of the concerns were of the commission to have a meaningful discussion?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So first, I just want to say, in case my comments of passion were misconstrued, I surely didn't mean any disrespect for any of the commissioners, and Commissioner Marks, my remarks were definitely not directed at you, as you know, around timing or any of that. So I want to make sure you realize that really the biggest issue for us is that we believe this credit is somewhat being mischaracterized and or what the value of that credit is. And so I believe I've got the notes from what everybody said. And I believe I have enough information to understand the concerns around clarity on what's going to be provided in these parks, around clarity for some more defining language in the document that's more understandable from Commissioner Alpert. I understand the issue around understanding the hours of the parks and you know, so yeah, I do believe I have enough information to have a good dialogue with staff around the issues that were raised tonight. Even though we may disagree on some of the items, I think I understand them.
Okay, that's at this point, all I can do is ask you, do you understand them and are you willing to enter into a discussion? I think the answer to both questions is yes. And I'm guessing that the city staff does too. All right. That being said, here's what I would like. I would like someone to make a motion to continue the hearing on the CITYWALK development agreement issue to a date. Now, my question, we can do one of two things, either to a date certain, if the two participants in the discussion think it's enough time. I know Ms. Chamberlain shaking her head up and down, let the record reflect that she would like a date certain. Is our next meeting a reasonable time?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Engen, is it?
Yes.
All right, so I would like a motion to be made to continue the hearing to our next date, which would be the 20th of October. I would like that motion seconded by someone, and then we'll do a roll call vote. So you need to unmute yourself to make the motion.
Little machine is.
You're muted.
Okay, okay. I'll move that we, okay. I move that we continue the discussion of the development agreement to, is it October the 20th is the date? I don't know.
Yes.
The development agreement discussion for the CITYWALK projects to October the 20th. Is that sufficient, Debbie?
It is.
Yeah, okay.
We have a second.
I will second that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to continue the hearing on the CITYWALK development agreement to October 20th. We have a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Alpert,
Aye.
Seconder Vice Chair Kuznick,
Aye.
Commissioner Frank,
Aye.
Commissioner Marks,
Aye.
Chair Wallace.
Aye.
So the motion passes 5-0. And item 10.1 will be continued to a date certain, October 20th.
Thank you. All right, thank you. We're going to move on to item number 11.
Eric, before you do that, Jerry, I too can get overly passionate at times. And if I came off as hot-headed, it's because sometimes I am, and I apologize if I did. I think you're a good guy. I think you're doing the right, trying to do the right thing. I think we can come to some reasonable conclusion.
I agree. Thank you.
Just for the record, you have to do a lot more than this to get me angry, okay? All right. Let's move on to item number 11, non-public hearing action items. We have none. Item 12, staff study session. We don't. Commissioner liaison reports, and then the calendar from Mr. Barr. So let's start off. Do we have any commissioner liaison reports?
Yes, I zoomed in on the Parks and Community Services Commission meeting. I think it was September the 23rd, where they talked about this issue, and I'm not going to go into any of the details.
Okay. Commissioner Kuznick?
Okay, so the Transportation Advisory Committee met. We discussed the Innovate 680 project, which is coming along and has some interesting goals for that. It was a discussion of permit parking up at the Travari and Miravia area. Apparently the apartment people are parking in the neighborhood and they don't like it. I was very excited to hear about the Crow Canyon widening project because that's right by my house. So that's in the works for 2021. And then the Street Smarts program has gone digital, and so they're encouraging folks to submit for the educational component that would normally happen in schools to happen online. And then finally, they are working on creating a committee to update the toolkit for the residential traffic calming, that has not been updated in quite a long time. And so they're going to draft policy changes around the issue of the residential traffic calming measures when they get implemented and how that gets happening. And then both Chair Wallace and I, although we didn't know it at the time, zoomed in on the East Bay Mud presentation, and that was very informative. I will say that this was their first Zoom meeting. Imagine that after all this time. But it was really interesting in the difference between water treatment plants versus drinking water supplies, recycled water, how the power shutoffs affect our water supply, and those kinds of things. So it was very informative, and you're talking a lot of money, but they have a 2-year budget. So Chair Wallace, if you have anything else you can add to that particular meeting. But
the only thing I would add is that our representative is Mr. Coleman, and apparently the water supply that East Bay Mud has on hand right now is at least normal, if not slightly above normal. Mm-hmm. So we will probably be okay for this coming year. For those who are in the East Bay Mud territories, most of Doherty Valley is not in East Bay Mud, it's Zone 7. They get most of their water from Lake Oroville. So mm-hmm. They are usually in a more tenuous situation than us on the other side of the hill because of the water supply. So, okay, Commissioner Alpert or Commissioner Frank have anything to report? I see a head shaking left, right. No. All right, Commissioner, Mr. Barr, would you give us the calendar for the next meeting or two if you can?
Sure. So October 20th, as you're aware, we have a continued public hearing on the CITYWALK development agreements. We also had a continued public hearing for the Bridges patio concept. We're going to be asking to continue that out to November 17th. There's some additional work that's being done by the applicant, and it's too quick to get to it for this meeting. And then lastly, we will be bringing you the Costco gas station on Fostoria. And so we'll be entertaining a land use permit and public hearing for that. Right now, November 3rd, we anticipate a cancellation. And then, as we mentioned, on the 17th, we will have the Bridges patio and valet concept.
Okay. Any other comments from staff? If not, there being no objection, this meeting is adjourned.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.